There is a small room at the edge of a dead city, and inside it, the fire never finished its work. It is a workshop, a kiln really, a clay oven built for hardening tablets, the kind of place where a man would sit with a reed stylus and press words into wet earth until they became permanent. On the day the city died, that oven was full. Dozens of clay tablets sat inside it, freshly written, waiting for the heat that would turn soft mud into stone, turn a fragile thought into something that could outlast 100 winters. The heat came, but it did not come from the kiln. It came from the walls. When archaeologists finally opened that room, more than 3,000 years later, they found those tablets exactly where they had been left, baked hard, not by the careful craft of a scribe, but by the inferno that swallowed the entire city around them. The fire that was supposed to gently preserve a few words, instead preserved everything. It froze a single afternoon in place forever. And because of that accident, because of that one catastrophic, city-killing fire, we can still read what those tablets say. We can read the last words of a world that did not know it was ending. One of them is a letter. The king of this city is writing to another king far across the sea, and the words are not the words of a man making conversation. They are the words of a man who has just looked out at the water and seen something he was not supposed to see. He writes that the enemy's ships have already come, that his own fleet is gone, sent away, somewhere else, on someone else's orders, that his soldiers are not here, that his city is open and unguarded and alone. And then the letter simply stops. We do not know if it was ever sent. We do not know if the king who wrote it lived through the night. We do not know the name of the scribe who pressed those final lines into the clay, or whether his hands were shaking when he did it. What we know is that the tablet was in that kiln, unfired, when the flames arrived, which means that in the last hours of this city's life, someone was still writing, still recording, still trying, against all reason, to leave a message for a future that he must have suspected would never read it. He was right that the future would come. He was wrong about almost everything else. Because what happened to that city was not a single tragedy. It was not a war between two peoples, not a plague, not the rise and fall of one ambitious king. What happened to that city happened to nearly every city like it, across an entire interconnected world, within the space of a single human lifetime. Capital after capital, palace after palace, kingdom after kingdom, the greatest empires of the age, the richest trading ports, the proudest fortresses, with walls so massive that the people who came after them could not believe human hands had built them, and decided giants must have done it instead. All of it gone, burned, abandoned, emptied, forgotten. In some places, the survivors did not even know what they had lost. They would walk among the ruins of their grandparents' world and tell stories about gods and monsters, because the truth, that ordinary people had once lived here, in cities of stone and gold and writing, had become literally unbelievable. This is the story of how an entire civilization, not one nation, but a whole connected web of nations, came apart at almost the same moment. It is one of the largest and most mysterious collapses in all of human history. And the strangest part, the part that has haunted the people who study it for over a century, is this: we still are not completely sure why. Hold on to that, because everything you are about to hear is, in a sense, a single long attempt to answer that question. And the answer, when we finally arrive at it, is going to feel less like solving a mystery and more like looking into a mirror. Let me take you back before the fire, back to the world as it was when it still believed it would last forever. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand how good it was. We tend to imagine the ancient past as something primitive, mud and spears, small villages, people who never traveled more than a day's walk from where they were born. And for most of human history, in most of the world, that picture is not entirely wrong. But there was a window of time, roughly 5 centuries ending a little over 3,000 years ago, when a corner of the planet did something remarkable. It became connected. Picture the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, and the lands wrapped around it like cupped hands. Egypt to the south, ancient even then, with its temples and its god-king, and its river that flooded on schedule like clockwork. To the north and east, the great kingdoms of the Near East, Babylon, Assyria, the empire of the Hittites sprawling across what we now call Turkey. Across the water, on the islands and the mountainous mainland of Greece, the Mycenaeans, warrior traders who built fortresses on the hilltops and buried their dead with masks of beaten gold. And threaded between all of them, dotting the coastlines like beads on a string, the merchant cities, places whose entire reason for existing was to move things from one great power to another. These were not isolated peoples. This was a system, a network, a living organism made of kingdoms, and like any organism, every part of it depended on every other part. Consider how a single object moved through this world. A man in one of the coastal cities wants to make a sword, or rather, he wants to make the bronze that the sword will be made from. Bronze is not something you dig out of the ground. Bronze is a recipe. It is copper mixed with a smaller amount of tin, melted together to make a metal far harder and more useful than either one alone. This is the metal that the entire age is named for. It is in the weapons and the armor, the tools and the cauldrons, the ceremonial cups of kings and the plow tips of farmers. An entire civilization built on a single alloy. And here is the secret that almost no one living in that world fully understood: the quiet fault line running underneath everything. The two ingredients of bronze were almost never found in the same place. Copper you could get. There was a great island in the eastern Mediterranean so rich in copper ore that its very name would one day become our word for the metal. Ships sailed from there heavy with raw copper, cast into ingots shaped, strangely, hauntingly, like the stretched hide of an ox, four-cornered, easy to carry on the shoulder. That part of the recipe was difficult, but manageable. Tin was the problem. Tin was the problem because tin was almost nowhere. The nearest large sources were unimaginably far away, in the mountains of Central Asia, thousands of miles to the east, and on cold islands at the far western edge of the known world, places these people had likely never seen and could barely conceive of. For tin to reach a workshop on the Mediterranean coast, it had to pass through dozens of hands, across deserts and mountains and seas, traded from kingdom to kingdom, each one taking its cut, each one trusting the next link in a chain that stretched halfway across a continent. Think about what that means. Think about how much had to go right. Every bronze sword in every king's armory, every bronze blade that defended every city, depended on a thread of trade so long and so thin that no single person could see all of it at once. A war in one place, a drought in another, a single ambitious bandit king who decided to choke a mountain pass. Any of these could reach out across the whole world and stop the flow of tin to a city that had never even heard the name of the place where the tin came from. The people of the Bronze Age built the most spectacular weapons of their time out of a metal whose supply lay almost entirely beyond their control. And they did it without ever quite realizing how exposed that left them. They had built a magnificent house on a foundation they could not see. But for a long, long time, for centuries, the system held. And while it held, it produced something the ancient world had never seen before and would not see again for a very long time. A kind of golden peace among the powerful. We actually have their letters. That is the astonishing thing. We can listen in on the most powerful people on Earth talking to each other. In the sands of Egypt, archaeologists once uncovered an archive of clay tablets, the diplomatic mail of a pharaoh and his predecessors. And what those letters reveal is a club, an exclusive, jealous, faintly ridiculous club of great kings who wrote to each other not as strangers, but as family. They called each other brother. Brother king to brother king, across hundreds of miles, in a shared diplomatic language that none of them spoke as their mother tongue. The Pharaoh of Egypt and the king of Babylon and the king of the Hittites and the rest, they exchanged gifts, they exchanged daughters in marriage, they exchanged complaints. And the complaints are wonderful because they are so human. One king writes to another, essentially that the gold he was promised has not arrived, and that the gold he did receive turned out to be lower quality than agreed, and that frankly, he is hurt. Another grumbles that his brother did not send messengers to ask after his health when he was sick. And what kind of brother does that? They negotiate marriages like men haggling over livestock and then write tender, anxious notes about whether the bride is being treated well. They are vain and petty and grasping, and underneath it all, unmistakably, they are at peace. That is the part we forget. For these few centuries, the great powers of the Eastern world had largely stopped destroying each other. They had discovered something better than conquest. They had discovered trade and the slow, mutual addiction of getting rich together. A king in one land needed the timber that grew in another. A king who had no gold mines needed the gold that flowed out of Egypt like water. The Mycenaean warlords across the sea wanted the luxuries of the East, and they had silver and oil and fine pottery to trade for them. Everyone needed the copper from the great island, and the tin from beyond the edge of everything, and the grain that the wide fields of certain kingdoms could grow in surplus. And so they were bound together, not by love, though they used the language of love, but by need, by the simple, powerful fact that they were all worth more to each other alive and trading than dead and burning. It was, in its way, the first globalization, a world that had figured out how to be interdependent, a world where a craftsman on one coast worked metal that had touched 4 civilizations before it reached his hands, and where a king could be furious about the quality of a foreign gift precisely because foreign gifts had become a normal part of life. And like our world, it must have felt permanent. It must have felt like the natural order of things, the way the world simply was. The wealthy stayed wealthy, the trade routes stayed open, the brother kings wrote their letters, the river flooded on time, the ships came and went. Why would any of that ever change? But hold that feeling. Hold the feeling of permanence. Because the people who feel most certain that their world will last are almost always the people standing closest to its end. Somewhere out there, beyond the comfortable maps of the brother kings, forces were already gathering. Not one force, many. And not all at once. That is what makes this story so disorienting, so hard to pin down even now. The end did not come as a single blow. It came the way a great old tree dies, not when the axe falls, but in the slow, invisible years before, when the roots are already rotting in the dark and every leaf still looks green. The roots were already rotting, and no one had looked underground in a very long time. Let me show you that world the way it actually moved. Not through the letters of kings this time, but through a single ship. Off the southern coast of what is now Turkey, beneath about 150 feet of clear blue water, divers found the oldest seagoing wreck ever discovered. It had gone down sometime in the final stretch of the Bronze Age, a small wooden trading vessel, no longer than a modern bus, that struck a rocky point and slid into the deep, taking everything it carried with it. And what it carried is the closest thing we will ever have to a photograph of that lost world's beating heart. Imagine standing on the dock the morning that ship was loaded. The cargo coming aboard is staggering in its variety, and every piece of it tells you that this was not a local errand. This was a thread being pulled across the entire known world. There are the ingots, 10 tons of copper cast into those 4-cornered oxide shapes, stacked in the hold like a hoard out of legend. Enough raw metal to arm a small army, or to keep a city's workshops busy for a season. And beside the copper, the precious second ingredient, a ton of tin, the rare and distant metal, sitting in the same hold, the 2 halves of bronze finally reunited after their long separate journeys from opposite ends of the earth. On that single ship, in that single hold, you could see the entire fragile recipe of the age laid out in metal. But the ship carried so much more than that. There was glass, deep cobalt blue glass, cast into discs, glass so prized that it traveled between kingdoms as a royal gift. There was ebony dark wood from Africa. There were elephant tusks and hippopotamus teeth, raw ivory waiting to be carved. There were jars of fragrant resin, the kind burned in temples so that the smoke could carry prayers upward. There were ostrich eggshells and beads of amber that had come all the way from the cold northern seas of Europe, and tools and weapons and pottery from a half-dozen different cultures, and the personal seals of merchants, and weights for measuring out fair trade in marketplaces that spoke different languages. One small ship, and on it, the fingerprints of Africa, Europe, the Near East, the Mediterranean islands, all gathered together and bound for a single voyage. Now hold that image, that beautiful, crowded, miraculous little ship, and let yourself feel the second thing it tells us. The thing that should make the back of your neck go cold. It sank. For all its wealth, for all the brilliance of the world that built it, that ship hit a rock and went straight to the bottom, and everything on it was lost in an afternoon. The tin that had crossed a continent, the copper, the gold, the ivory, the glass, the prayers waiting to be burned, gone in the time it takes the sea to fill a wooden hull. The men aboard her, and there would have been men aboard her, vanished into the same water, leaving not even their names. That is the truth that lived underneath the whole shining age, the truth the brother kings never wrote into their letters. Everything that connected their world also exposed it. Every ship that carried wealth could carry it to the bottom. Every trade route that brought prosperity was also a thread that could be cut. The very thing that made them rich, their dependence on each other, on the sea, on the long thin chains of supply that crossed the entire world, was the same thing that could destroy them. They had traded self-sufficiency for abundance. It was a good trade. For 500 years, it was the best trade anyone had ever made. But a civilization that depends on everything going right has quietly agreed to a terrible bargain. It has agreed that when things start to go wrong, when even a few of the threads begin to fray at once, they will not fail one at a time, politely, in sequence. They will fail together. And the threads were about to start fraying. All of them. Almost at once. Let me bring you closer to the people now, because it is too easy to talk about kingdoms and trade routes as if they were machines. They were not machines. They were millions of human beings, each one living a single life inside a world they assumed would outlast them. Picture a girl in one of the great Mycenaean citadels across the sea. One of those fortresses on the Greek hills, with walls built of stones so enormous that her own descendants would refuse to believe people had stacked them. She has grown up inside those walls, and to her, they are simply the shape of the world. The throne room with its painted floor, the storerooms heavy with oil and grain, the workshops where bronze is hammered and cloth is woven by women whose names are written down on clay tablets, because this is a literate world, an organized world, a world that counts and records and remembers. She has never known hunger. She has never known a year when the ships did not come. The men of her family go away sometimes, across the water, and come back with stories and scars and foreign things, a comb of ivory, a bead of blue glass, a copper bowl. To her, the horizon is not a wall. It is a door, and through that door comes everything good. She does not know that she may be one of the last people who will ever live this way. She does not know that within her lifetime, or her children's, the citadel will burn, the tablets will stop being written, and the great walls will stand empty for so long that her descendants will forget who built them. She does not know that the very skill of writing, the ability to press a name into clay, will simply vanish from her world, like a language no one speaks, leaving people who can build a wall but cannot write their own names. She does not know any of it. She is just a girl in a citadel, in the last good years, watching for the ships. And the ships, for now, still come. So let us widen the view one more time, and look at the four corners of this world, the great powers whose quarrels and friendships filled those diplomatic letters. Because to understand a collapse, you must first understand the height of what collapsed. In the south, anchoring everything, sat Egypt. By this point, Egypt was not young. It was almost incomprehensibly ancient, a civilization that had already been building pyramids and worshipping its god-kings for well over 1,000 years before this story even begins. It was the great constant, the immovable thing, the kingdom whose very stability the others measured themselves against. Its pharaohs ruled over a land made fertile by a river that flooded with such reliable generosity that the Egyptians built their entire sense of cosmic order around it. Order. They had a word for it, a sacred principle, the rightness of things, the proper arrangement of the world, the king's holy duty to hold back chaos and keep the universe running the way it was meant to run. Remember that idea, order against chaos. The king as the wall that holds back the dark. Because the day is coming when an Egyptian king will carve into stone the most chilling description of chaos that the ancient world ever produced, and he will be describing something he saw with his own eyes. To the north, in the highlands of what is now Turkey, sprawled the empire of the Hittites. And if Egypt was the ancient constant, the Hittites were the rising superpower, the kingdom that had clawed its way up to challenge the pharaohs directly. They had fought Egypt to a standstill in one of the most famous battles of the entire age, and then, in a move that tells you everything about this world, the two exhausted superpowers had signed a peace treaty. An actual written treaty, the oldest surviving peace agreement in human history, sworn before the gods of both nations. Two empires that had bled each other white had decided, in the end, that they would rather be brothers than corpses. The Hittite capital was a mountain fortress, a city of stone gates carved with lions and warrior gods, ruled by a king who was also a high priest, who climbed into the hills each year to honor 1,000 gods. It was a hard kingdom in a hard land, and that hardness contained a hidden weakness we will return to, because the Hittites, for all their power, could not always feed themselves. Their stony highlands did not grow enough grain, and a kingdom that cannot feed itself has handed a piece of its fate to whoever grows its food. Hold that thread, too. The empire of warriors and stone lions, quietly dependent on grain shipped in from across the sea. Another thin line, another thing that only works as long as everything works. Across the water from the Hittites, on the islands and the rugged mainland of Greece, were the Mycenaeans, the world of the girl in the citadel. They were not a single empire, but a constellation of fierce, competitive kingdoms, each with its own fortress palace, each ruled by its own warlord, all sharing a culture of bronze and gold and war. They were sailors and raiders and traders, the muscle and the merchants of the Western Sea, and their reach extended everywhere the water touched. Long after they were gone, their descendants would tell stories about them, stories about a great war fought over a stolen queen, about heroes and gods and a city that burned. We know those stories. The descendants who told them had no idea they were remembering something real. To them, it was pure legend, a tale of an impossible golden age when men were greater than men could be now. But it was not pure legend. There really had been a golden age. There really had been heroes in bronze and great walls and ships crossing the wine-dark sea. The storytellers were not inventing a fantasy. They were remembering a world their people had lost so completely that its truth had curdled into myth. And threaded between all these giants, Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and the other great kingdoms further east, were the merchant cities, the middlemen, the ports, the places where it all came together, where the copper met the tin, where the grain ships docked and the diplomats passed through, and the wealth of 4 civilizations changed hands. One of those cities was the place we began, the city of the kiln, the city of the last letter. It was, in its day, one of the richest and most cosmopolitan ports in the entire world, a place where you could hear a dozen languages in a single afternoon, where merchants kept their records in multiple scripts, where the harbor was thick with masts and the warehouses were stuffed with the goods of every nation. It was a hinge, a connector. A city that lived entirely on the fact that the world was open and the ships were moving. Which is exactly why, when the world began to close, a city like that one had nowhere to stand. Because here is the cruel logic of the system the Brother Kings had built. The places that grew rich on connection were the places that would die of disconnection. The cities that lived by the open sea would die by the closing of it. And the very position that made a port the beating heart of the Bronze Age, at the crossroads of everything, dependent on everyone, was the position from which there was no escape when everything, all at once, began to fail. The good years were not over yet. The ships still came, the letters still flowed, the brother kings still complained about gold. But far away, in places no diplomat was writing about, the rain had begun to fail. It did not announce itself. That is the first thing to understand about how this world began to die. There was no warning, no omen, no single terrible day. There was only weather, and weather is the easiest thing in the world to ignore, right up until it is the only thing that matters. Far beneath the surface of ancient lake beds, beneath the floors of caves where mineral-rich water has dripped slowly for thousands of years, the earth keeps records of its own. Trapped in those layers, in ancient pollen, in the chemistry of stone, in the rings of long-dead trees, is a memory of every wet year and every dry one. And when scientists learned to read that memory, they found something written into the final century of the Bronze Age that no king ever wrote into a letter, because no king could see it happening. The rains were failing, not in one place, but across a vast swath of this connected world, year after year, decade after decade. A long grinding drying out of the lands that fed everyone. The harvests that had always come came smaller. The reservoirs that had always filled less. The thin margin between enough food and not enough, the margin that complex societies live and die inside, began, slowly, silently, to close. And here is why that single fact is so dangerous. Why a few dry decades could threaten an entire civilization. In a simple world, a drought is a tragedy for the people who live where the drought is. They suffer, some die, and the world beyond their valley goes on untouched. But this was not a simple world. This was the connected world, the world of the brother kings and the trade ships and the long, thin chains of supply. And in a connected world, a drought does not stay where it starts. When a kingdom that grows surplus grain stops having a surplus, it stops exporting. And when it stops exporting, the kingdom that depended on those exports, the kingdom that could not feed itself, that had quietly handed a piece of its fate away, that kingdom begins to starve, even if not a single drop of its own rain has failed. Remember the hidden weakness of the Hittites? The empire of stone lions, the rising superpower, the warriors who had fought Egypt to a standstill? Their highland kingdom could not grow enough grain to feed itself. It never could. For generations they had made up the difference by importing food, buying it, demanding it, shipping it in across the sea from the fertile lands of others. And now we can read the letters. We can read the most powerful empire in the northern world reduced to begging. A Hittite king writes, to the merchant city, to the great ports, about grain. Send grain. It is, the message makes clear, a matter of life and death. Ships must be found, food must be loaded, the cargo must come, and it must come now, because the people are starving and there is nothing else. This is not diplomacy as usual, not a brother king grumbling about the quality of a gift. This is an empire with a knife at its throat, writing to its trading partners in the language of pure survival. Picture what lies behind a letter like that. Picture the granaries standing empty in a mountain capital. Picture the king, who is also the high priest, who is supposed to be the one man on earth who can keep his 1,000 gods satisfied and his kingdom whole, sitting in his stone palace, dictating a plea to a foreign port because all his armies and all his gods cannot conjure bread out of a sky that has stopped giving rain. Picture the families in the villages below, watching the grain stores shrink, doing the terrible arithmetic of a hungry year. How many mouths? How much left? How long until spring? This is what the collapse looked like before it looked like fire. It looked like hunger. It looked like an empire of warriors discovering that the deadliest enemy it would ever face was the weather. And the hunger did something to the world that no army could have done. It frayed the bonds. The whole magnificent system of the Bronze Age ran on surplus, on the fact that there was extra, Enough extra that kings could trade it and gift it and ship it across the sea to make friends and buy loyalty. Surplus was the lubricant of the entire machine. Surplus was what made it possible to be generous, to be patient, to be brothers. Take away the surplus and watch what happens to brotherhood. The grain that used to flow freely now has to be fought for. The trade that used to enrich everyone now becomes a competition for shrinking scraps. The brother king who once received gifts now sends demands. And the merchant cities in the middle, the ports that lived on the flow, feel the current weakening around them, the ships growing fewer, the warehouses emptier, the easy wealth turning hard. A connected world is generous when it is full. When it begins to empty, that same connection becomes a network for transmitting desperation. The hunger in one place becomes the fear in another, which becomes the hoarding in a third, which becomes the collapse of trust everywhere. The threads that bound them together in prosperity now bind them together in panic. But hunger alone, slow and grinding, is not how this world ended. Hunger weakened it. Hunger pulled the foundations out from under it, year by quiet year. It made an entire civilization brittle. And brittle things do not bend. Brittle things shatter. The moment something strikes them hard enough. Something was about to strike. Out on the water, the ships started to change. For 500 years, a sail on the horizon had meant good things. A sail meant copper coming in, or grain, or the gifts of a brother king, or news from across the sea. A sail meant the world was working. Children must have run down to the harbors when the masts appeared, the way children always run toward the new and the arriving. A ship was a promise. And then, in the final decades of the Bronze Age, somewhere, for the first time, a sail on the horizon began to mean something else. It began to mean run. We do not know exactly when it started, or where, or with whom. That is part of the horror of it. There was no declaration, no single invading nation with a name and a flag and a known homeland. What the records describe instead is something stranger and more frightening, a phenomenon, a movement, a wave. The Egyptians, who left us the fullest account, did not write about an enemy kingdom. They wrote about peoples, many peoples, from many places, coming together, coming by sea and by land, moving across the world in a great migrating mass. Men and their weapons, but also their wives, their children, their oxen, their carts piled high with everything they owned. Modern people gave them a name the Egyptians never used. We call them the Sea Peoples. And the truth is that the name is a confession of our own ignorance, a label we slapped on a mystery because we did not know what else to call it. Who were they? Where did they come from? Why were they moving? These questions have been argued over for more than a century, and the honest answer is that we still do not fully know. The Egyptian records list names, coalitions of strange-sounding peoples, some of which might match places we can guess at, around the islands and coasts of the Mediterranean, and some of which we cannot place at all. They appear in the inscriptions like names read out from a roll call of the doomed and the dooming, peoples who burst onto the stage of history for one violent moment and then vanish from it forever, except for the ones who would settle down at the end of everything and give their name to a land that still carries an echo of it today. But here is the realization that changes everything, the shift that turns the Sea Peoples from villains into something far more unsettling. They were not just attackers. They were refugees. Look again at those carts. Look again at the wives and the children and the oxen, the whole families moving across the world. That is not the picture of an army setting out to conquer and return home with plunder. That is the picture of people who have no home to return to. People who are not raiding. People who are fleeing. People driven out of wherever they came from by something so bad that loading their entire lives onto carts and throwing themselves against the great empires of the age seemed like the better option. What drives whole peoples to do that? What empties a homeland so completely that its people would rather become a wandering wave of the dispossessed than stay? The same thing, perhaps, that was hollowing out the Hittite granaries. The same failing rains. The same collapsing harvests. The same hunger. Do you feel the shape of it starting to form? The drought does not just weaken the great kingdoms from within. It also breaks the smaller peoples on the edges, the ones with less margin, less surplus, less protection, breaks them first and breaks them hardest and sends them spilling out across the map in desperate search of somewhere, anywhere, that still has food. And where do starving, desperate, displaced people go? They go toward the wealth. They go toward the cities and the palaces and the granaries, the very places that, thanks to the same drought, are now weaker and hungrier and more brittle than they have been in 500 years. So picture it now, the whole terrible machine of it. The rains fail, the harvests shrink, the great kingdoms grow brittle from hunger and the fraying of trade. And at the very same moment, the same failing rains tear loose whole populations from the edges of the world and send them flooding inward, toward the brittle kingdoms, toward the rich ports, carrying with them the violence of the truly desperate. The victim and the weapon are the same crisis. The drought does not just wound the world, it also forges the thing that will come to finish the wounded. This is what makes the sea peoples so haunting, and so easy to misunderstand. For centuries, people imagined them as a mysterious horde of barbarian raiders, a sudden plague of violence out of nowhere. But they were not out of nowhere. They were the human face of the same catastrophe that was killing everyone. Ordinary families, with children and animals and household goods, who had been hungry for too long in a homeland that could no longer hold them, and who were now doing the oldest and most human thing in the world. They were trying to survive. And in trying to survive, they would help to bring an entire civilization down. An Egyptian king would later carve his account of them into the walls of a temple, and the words he chose have echoed for 3,000 years. He wrote that no land could stand before them, that the great kingdoms of the north had been swept away, one after another, as if they had never been, that a conspiracy of peoples was on the move, and that it was coming, with terrible certainty, for the last great power left standing, for Egypt itself. But before it reached Egypt, it would reach others. And to understand the full weight of what was coming, we have to go north, to the mountain capital of the stone lions, to the proud empire that had already begun to starve. Because the Hittites, the great rising superpower of the age, were about to become the first of the giants to fall. And no one wrote it down. That is the strangest part. The fall of an empire, and at the moment it happened, the silence was so total that we are still, 3,000 years later, trying to fill it in. Go north, then. Up into the high country, where the air is thin and the winters are cruel, to the capital of the empire that ruled the roof of this world. The Hittite capital sat among the hills like something carved by gods rather than men. To reach it, you climbed, and as you climbed, the walls rose to meet you. Miles of fortifications snaking along the ridge lines, punctuated by monumental gates. There was a gate flanked by stone lions, their faces worn but still fierce, guarding the approach. There was a gate carved with the figure of a warrior god, striding forward, armed, eternal. There were temples beyond counting, for a kingdom that honored 1,000 gods and could not afford to neglect a single one. There was the great palace on its high rock, the seat of a king who was warrior and priest, and the living link between his people and the divine. This was not a frontier outpost. This was the nerve center of an empire that had stared down Egypt and lived. For centuries, the most powerful decisions in the northern world had been made inside those walls. And then, within the span of this story, those walls fell silent. Here is the mystery that has unsettled archaeologists since they first dug into the ruins. When the capital of the Hittites finally burned, and it did burn, the scorch marks are still in the stone, it was, in large part, already empty. The great palace, the temples, the storerooms, when the fire came through, much of what should have been there was gone. The royal treasures, the most precious objects, the valuable metals, and, most tellingly of all, the heart of the empire's memory, its archives, its records, the clay tablets that held the laws and treaties and rituals and accounts of the Hittite state. The most important documents were not where they should have been. Someone, it seems, had taken them away. Think about what that implies. A city does not empty itself by accident. The most powerful kingdom in the north did not simply get caught by surprise and overrun in a single night. The evidence suggests something slower, sadder, and in a way, more chilling. An orderly departure. A decision. At some point, the rulers of the Empire of the Stone Lions appear to have looked at their situation, the starving years, the fraying trade, the gathering threats, and concluded that the capital could no longer be held. And so, they did the unthinkable. They packed up the soul of their empire and left. Picture that procession leaving the high city. The carts loaded with the tablets of 1,000 years of statecraft. The priests carrying the sacred images of the gods, because a god's home is wherever its image goes, and a city without its gods is just stones. The royal household, the treasures, the memory of an empire, all winding down out of the hills, leaving the great gates and the lion guardians behind. And the question that nobody could answer, the question hanging over the whole grim caravan, leaving for where? To go where? In a world that was failing everywhere at once, where exactly does the king of a dying empire imagine he is going to rebuild? There may have been no answer. There may have been nowhere. That is what makes the empty capital so haunting. It is not the story of a city that was destroyed. It is the story of a city that was abandoned by people who knew, on some level, that there was no longer anywhere safe to take their world. And then, after they were gone, or perhaps as they were leaving, the fire came anyway. The empty palace burned. The empty temples burned. The great fortifications were breached, and the gates were thrown down. Whether it was the displaced peoples, or hungry neighbors, or the empire's own rebellious subjects, or simply the chaos that floods in wherever order withdraws, we do not know, and we may never know. What we know is the ending. The stone lions were left to guard a corpse. The capital of the Hittites, the nerve center of the northern world, became a ruin in the hills, its name forgotten so completely that thousands of years later the people living nearby had no idea a great empire had ever stood there. An entire empire, gone. And there is no triumphant enemy in the story, no conquering rival who can be blamed and named. There is only a withdrawal into silence, and then fire, and then nothing. We do have one last glimpse of the Hittite kings before the dark closes over them, and it is, fittingly, a glimpse of them fighting at the very edge of their world, far from the high capital. The last great king of the Hittites recorded that he fought battles at sea, naval battles against ships, out near the great Copper Island. A landlocked empire of mountain warriors suddenly forced to fight on the water against an enemy coming out of the waves. He claimed victory. Kings always claim victory. But you do not fight desperate sea battles at the far edge of your territory unless something has gone very wrong at the center. You do not, at the height of your power, find yourself battling fleets near a distant island while your own capital starves behind you. That naval battle is the last clear word we have from the Empire of the Stone Lions. The king who fought it sails into the records and then sails out of them, into total silence. We do not know how he died, or where, or whether he lived to see the end. We do not know the fate of the procession that carried the tablets out of the high city. The most powerful institution in the northern world simply stops transmitting, like a voice on a line that goes suddenly, permanently dead. And this is the pattern we are going to see again and again, the signature of this collapse, the thing that distinguishes it from an ordinary war or conquest. When an empire is conquered, the conqueror writes about it. There is a victor to boast, a new ruler to take the throne, a continuity of records under new management. But when this happened, when the Hittites fell, when the great citadels burned, there is no victor's account. There is just a stop. The writing simply ends. The lights go out one by one, and no one turns them back on, and no one explains. It is the most frightening kind of ending there is. Not the ending where you are defeated, the ending where there is no one left to record that you were ever there at all. Now feel what the fall of the Hittites does to everything around it, because this is where the true terror of an interconnected world reveals itself. The Hittites did not fall alone. They could not fall alone. They were a load-bearing wall in a structure where everything held everything else up. When the Empire of the North went silent, it did not just remove one player from the board. It tore a hole in the whole web. Every trade route that ran through Hittite lands, every road and pass and harbor they had kept safe, every market that depended on their order, all of it was suddenly thrown into chaos. The grain that used to flow north to feed them stopped flowing, which hurt the southern ports that had grown rich shipping it. The metals that used to move through their territory found their roads blocked or unsafe. The diplomatic letters, the marriages, the careful balance of power among the brother kings, all of it had assumed the Hittites would always be there, a fixed point, a great power among great powers. And now, that fixed point was gone. This is what people mean when they talk about a system collapsing rather than a kingdom falling. A kingdom falling is a wound. A system collapsing is a cascade. Pull out one great power, and you do not get a slightly smaller world with one fewer kingdom in it. You get a world where every remaining piece is now under more strain, more exposed, more brittle than before, because each piece had been quietly relying on the piece that just disappeared. The fall of the Hittites made the fall of everyone else more likely, and the fall of each of those, in turn, would make the next fall more likely still. The collapse was not a series of separate tragedies that happened to occur around the same time. It was a single chain reaction, racing through the connections that the brother kings had spent 5 centuries building, using their own beautiful network of trade and trust as the wire along which the catastrophe traveled. Somewhere in the merchant cities of the coast, the harbor masters and the palace officials must have started to notice. The ships from the north stopped coming. The familiar names stopped appearing in the trade records. The letters from certain kings simply ceased to arrive, and no one knew quite why, and the silence where their voices used to be grew longer and more frightening. It would have been like watching the lights of distant cities, one by one, going dark across a darkening plain, and knowing, with a slow rising dread, that the darkness was moving in your direction. And it was. It was coming for the coast. It was coming for the great ports, the connectors, the hinges of the whole shining world. It was coming for the city of the kiln. We have been circling back toward it this whole time. The place where we began, the city of the last letter, the unfired tablet in the burning oven. We left its king standing at the edge of the water, watching the enemy's ships arrive. Now, finally, we are ready to understand exactly how that moment came to be. Because the fall of that one city, a place we can name, a king we can name, a sequence of events we can almost reconstruct hour by hour from the words baked into its clay, is the closest we will ever come to standing inside the collapse as it happened. It is the moment the abstract becomes unbearably specific. The moment the great impersonal cascade reaches down and touches a single frightened man holding a single piece of clay in the last hours of a city that had stood for 1,000 years. The city had a name. It is right to use it now, because we have earned our way back to it, and because a city that left us its last words deserves to be called by its own. The city was Ugarit. For close to 1,000 years it had stood on the coast, a little inland from a harbor that opened onto all the sea lanes of the eastern Mediterranean. And in its final centuries it had become something extraordinary, perhaps the single most connected place in the entire connected world. If the Bronze Age had a beating commercial heart, Ugarit was a strong candidate for the chamber where the blood pooled before flowing out to everywhere else. Walk its streets in the good years, and you would have understood the whole age in an afternoon. The harbor crowded with ships from every kingdom, the warehouses heavy with copper from the great island, with grain and oil and wine, with timber and textiles and worked metal, and luxury goods bound for the tables of kings. Merchants from a dozen nations, speaking a dozen tongues, striking deals in the streets. And in the scribal quarters, something that tells you exactly what kind of place this was. The records of Ugarit were kept in multiple scripts and multiple languages, because no single language could capture the traffic of a city that talked to the entire world. They even developed a writing of their own, a streamlined system, simpler than the dense scripts of the older empires, a hint of the great change in writing that was coming, though they would not live to see it flower. This was a city built entirely on the proposition that the world was open. Its wealth, its power, its very reason for being, all rested on the free movement of ships and goods across a peaceful sea. Ugarit had no great army to speak of, no mountain fastness to retreat into, no surplus of self-sufficiency to fall back on. It did not need any of those things, as long as the system held. It was a creature of the network, perfectly adapted to a connected world. Which is another way of saying that it was perfectly unprepared for the world to close. We can watch the closing happen almost in real time through the letters. And the letters are unbearable because they are so ordinary right up until the moment they are not. The king of Ugarit in those final years, we know his name, it was Amurapi, comes across in the correspondence as a young ruler, perhaps inexperienced, trying to manage an avalanche with the tools of a calmer age. He writes to his overlord, to neighboring kings, to the king of the great copper island across the water. And the subject, more and more, is the ships. The strange ships, the enemy on the sea. In one exchange that survives, the king of the copper island writes to Ugarit with a warning and a question, the kind of message that should never have to be sent between trading partners. Enemy ships have been sighted. Be on your guard. Where are your own forces? Where is your fleet? Why are your towns left undefended? And the reply from Ugarit is one of the most devastating documents to survive from the entire ancient world. The king of Ugarit answers, in effect, "My ships are not here. My fleet is away, far to the west, stationed in distant waters. My soldiers are not here either. My troops are in the land of the Hittites, sent north to help an overlord who is himself collapsing. The country is stripped bare, and meanwhile, the enemy's ships have already come. They have already burned my towns. They have done terrible things to my land." He asks, and you can hear the disbelief in it, the dawning horror of a man realizing the scale of what is happening. Does my overlord not know that all of my forces are gone? That I have nothing left? That the enemy is here, and I am alone? Read that again and feel the trap close. The fleet that should have been guarding Ugarit's harbor was somewhere else. The army that should have manned its walls had been marched off to prop up a dying empire to the north. At the exact moment the city needed everything it had nothing, because all of its strength had been spent answering the demands of the very network that was supposed to protect it. The obligations of the system pulled Ugarit's defenders away precisely when the system was failing. The city died with its sword arm reaching out to help someone else. This is the cruelty of the interconnected world made flesh. Ugarit was not destroyed because it was weak and isolated. It was destroyed because it was strong and connected, because it was a faithful member of a network that, in its collapse, demanded everything from its members and then left them defenseless. The same bonds that had made Ugarit rich for 1,000 years reached into the city in its final hour and pulled the weapons out of its hands. And now we come back to the kiln, to the workshop with the oven full of unfired tablets, to the very last words. We do not know the precise final hours of Ugarit, but we know enough to feel the shape of them. We know the city burned, fiercely, completely, a destruction so total that it was never rebuilt and never reoccupied, a city that simply ended and stayed ended. We know that in the ruins, in that scribal workshop, the tablet sat in the kiln, written but unfired, baked hard by the catastrophe rather than by the craft. Which means that in the final stretch of the city's life, the scribes were still at their posts, still writing, still recording official business, letters, accounts, the ordinary paperwork of a functioning state, even as the end came down on them. Picture that scribe one more time, the one we began with. Picture him in his workshop, the smell of wet clay, the reed stylus in his hand, the orderly stacks of tablets that represent the ongoing life of his city. He has done this work his whole life. His father may have done it before him. It is steady, respectable, civilized work, the work of a man who serves a great and ancient port at the center of the world. And then, on a day like any other, the smell changes, the light changes. There is shouting in the streets, and then a different kind of shouting, and then the particular orange flicker that means a fire that is not in a hearth where it belongs. He keeps writing. What else is there to do? Perhaps he is recording the very crisis as it unfolds. Perhaps he is finishing a letter that will never be sent, addressed to a king who is already dead or fleeing, in a city that is already burning. He presses the words into the clay with hands that may be perfectly steady, the long habit of his craft carrying him through the unthinkable, or with hands that are shaking so badly he can barely form the signs. And then the fire reaches the workshop. The roof, the walls, the wooden beams, the heat rolls in, and it does to those soft clay tablets exactly what the kiln was always meant to do. It bakes them, hardens them, makes them permanent, fixes them forever. The scribe's last act of writing is preserved by the very thing that kills him. The catastrophe becomes the curator. And 3,000 years later, we lift those tablets out of the ash and read the final thoughts of a city that did not know, until the very end, that it was already over. That is Ugarit, a city that lived on connection and died of it. A city whose last words were a plea for help that no one could answer, written by men who stayed at their posts while the world ended around them. When the archaeologists found it, the destruction was so complete and so final that the great port, the beating heart of Bronze Age trade, had simply ceased to exist as a living place, leaving only the burned outline of its last terrible day. And here is the detail that turns the knife, the realization that recontextualizes everything we thought we understood about who held power in this world. For 1,000 years, the small merchant cities like Ugarit had imagined themselves as the lucky middlemen, clever, prosperous, safely tucked between the great powers, profiting from everyone's needs while bearing none of the great empire's risks. They thought their connectedness made them safe. They thought sitting at the center of everything was the safest place to be. They had it exactly backwards. The center of the network was the most dangerous place of all. When the system failed, the great empires, with their mountains and their armies and their ancient roots, could absorb blows, could retreat, could bleed and survive in some diminished form. But the merchant cities, which were nothing but connection, which had no body apart from the network, when the network died, they died with it, instantly and totally, leaving not even a ruling dynasty to mourn them. The most sophisticated, most cosmopolitan, most modern places in the entire Bronze Age were the first and the most utterly erased. There is a lesson buried in that, and we will dig it up properly before we are done. But for now, sit with the picture of the burned port and the baked tablets, and carry it forward. Because the wave that took Ugarit was not slowing down. It had taken the empire of the stone lions. It had taken the great trading heart of the coast. It had taken city after city after city, all along the eastern shore of the sea, in a swath of destruction so wide and so thorough that when archaeologists map it out, it looks less like a war and more like a wound torn straight across the body of the world. And it was still moving south. South toward the river. South toward the oldest and proudest power of them all. South toward the one kingdom that had survived everything history had ever thrown at it. The kingdom that thought of itself not as one power among many, but as the very embodiment of cosmic order against chaos. The wave was coming for Egypt. And Egypt, alone among the great powers, was going to look the catastrophe directly in the face and write down what it saw. Egypt had seen the first edge of it before the great wave ever came. A generation earlier, a pharaoh had already faced a coalition out of the west and the sea, peoples pressing in on the fertile delta, some of them bearing names that would appear again in the catastrophe to come. That earlier pharaoh had beaten them back, and he had celebrated, and he had carved his triumph into stone alongside the names of all the lands he claimed to have subdued. It was, to him, just another victory in a long reign of victories, the ordinary business of a god-king holding chaos at bay. He did not understand what he had glimpsed. He thought he had won a battle. What he had actually seen was the first scout of a flood, the leading edge of a migration that was only beginning to gather its full and terrible weight far away. He had brushed against the future and mistaken it for the past. The full weight arrived a generation later, in the reign of a pharaoh whose name we should hold on to, because he is the man who left us the most vivid account of the apocalypse that survives from anyone who actually lived through it. His name was Ramses, the third king to bear that name, and on the walls of his great mortuary temple, a temple that still stands, its inscriptions still legible after 3,000 years, he carved the story of the day the end of the world arrived at his border. The words are not the calm boasting of a king listing conquests. They are something closer to a witness statement. He describes a great conspiracy of peoples gathered on the move, an alliance of nations from the islands and the coasts. He says that no land had been able to stand before their arms, and then he names them, the great kingdoms that had already been swept away, the empire of the north, the lands of the coast, city after city, kingdom after kingdom, listed not as enemies he had defeated, but as the dead, the already fallen, the places that the wave had erased before it ever reached him. He describes the enemy as a fire sweeping forward. He describes them coming with their families and their possessions, by land and by sea, an entire migrating world bearing down on the last great power left standing. Read that inscription, and you realize something staggering. The Pharaoh of Egypt, the most powerful man in the surviving world, who genuinely believed himself to be a living god, the cosmic guarantor of order against chaos, was, in that moment, terrified. Not terrified the way a man is terrified of an enemy army. Terrified the way a man is terrified when he watches the recognizable world come apart, when the great fixed kingdoms he has known his whole life are spoken of in the past tense, when the news from the north is not of a defeat, but of a vanishing. He was the last king reading the letters that had stopped arriving from everyone else. He was watching the lights go out across the plain, one by one, and he knew, he could not know, that the darkness was almost at his door. And then, unlike everyone else in this story, Egypt did the one thing the others could not. Egypt stood. The great battle came in two parts, by land and by sea, and the sea battle is the one Ramesses chose to immortalize in stone, perhaps because it was the strangest and the most desperate. The enemy ships came on toward the mouths of the river, into the maze of the delta, and the Egyptians met them there. And the genius of it, the thing that saved Egypt, was that the Egyptians fought a sea battle as if it were a hunt. They did not simply meet the invaders ship to ship in open water, where the desperate fury of the sea peoples might have overwhelmed them. They lured the enemy fleet into the river mouths, into the narrow channels, and there, hemmed in, the invaders lost the advantage of their numbers and their momentum. Picture the chaos of it. The crowded ships jammed into the delta channels, unable to maneuver. The Egyptian archers lining the banks, raining arrows down into the packed enemy boats from the safety of dry land. Egyptian ships closing in to grapple and board. The carved relief shows it as a frozen moment of utter pandemonium. Overturned vessels, men spilling into the water, bodies in the reeds, the orderly ranks of Egypt against the tangled, drowning mass of the invaders. It was not a noble battle. It was a slaughter and a trap. And that is exactly why it worked. Egypt won because it refused to fight fair, because it used its land and its river and its archers to turn the invaders' own desperate momentum against them. The land battle, too, went Egypt's way. The carts and the families and the warriors who came by land were met and broken. And when it was over, Ramesses had done what no other ruler in the entire collapsing world managed to do. He had faced the wave that swept away empires, and he had held. Egypt survived, the river still flooded, the god-king still sat his throne. Order had held back chaos one more time. It should have been the great triumph of the age. And in the inscriptions, of course, it is, a glorious, total, world-saving victory carved in stone for eternity. But here is where we have to be careful, where we have to read past what the king wanted us to believe and see what the evidence actually shows. Because Egypt's victory was real, and Egypt's victory was also the beginning of its long, slow death. Think about what survival actually cost. To stand against the wave, Egypt had to spend everything. Its armies, its grain, its treasure, its strength, poured out to hold a border against a flood of the desperate. And even total victory in such a battle does not refill an empty granary or revive a strangled trade route. The world that Egypt had been part of, the network of brother kings and trade ships and copper and tin, was gone. Egypt had won the battle, but it had won it inside a world that was no longer there. It was a victorious survivor standing alone in a graveyard. And a survivor alone in a graveyard does not get to go back to the way things were. There is no way back to. The two is gone. So watch what happens to Egypt in the years and decades after the great victory, because this is where the story turns truly dark, in a quieter and more insidious way than burning cities. The triumph fades, and what comes after it is not glory, but a long unraveling. The trade that had made Egypt rich was crippled. The partners it traded with were ash and ruin. The flow of foreign goods slowed to a trickle, and the kingdom that had stood like a god against the chaos of the world began to be eaten, slowly, from the inside, by the ordinary mechanics of decline. We can actually trace it. We have records. In the workers' village near the great royal tombs, the skilled craftsmen who carved and painted the resting places of the pharaohs, something happened that had, as far as we know, never happened before in human history. The workers were not paid. The grain rations that were their wages did not arrive, again and again, because the system that delivered them was breaking down. And so those workers did something extraordinary, something that feels startlingly modern. They stopped working. They downed their tools, they marched out. They staged what may be the first recorded labor strike in the history of the world, sitting down in protest because the great machine of the Egyptian state could no longer reliably feed the very men who built its monuments to eternity. A strike, in the shadow of the royal tombs. It is such a small thing next to a burning empire, and yet it tells you everything. The chaos that Ramses had held back at the border had found another way in. It came not as an invading army, but as an empty grain wagon, as a wage that did not arrive, as the slow seizing up of a system that had been built for a richer, more connected world, and could no longer keep its promises in a poorer, lonelier one. And then came the tomb robberies. As the central authority weakened and the economy strained, even the sacred tombs of the god kings, the most protected, most taboo, most carefully guarded places in all of Egypt, began to be broken into and looted. We have the records of the investigations, the interrogations, the trials. The robbers were sometimes the very officials and workers who were supposed to protect the dead. When men are hungry enough, and the power that once frightened them is weak enough, even the bodies of gods are not safe. Do you see what is happening? Egypt did not fall the way Ugarit fell, in a single afternoon of fire. Egypt died the way a great old institution dies. Slowly, internally, through 1,000 small failures, each one survivable on its own, all of them together adding up to the end of an era. The unpaid workers, the empty granaries, the looted tombs, the shrinking borders, the fading of the empire's reach until the pharaoh who had once written as a brother king to the rulers of the world was reduced to ruling a smaller, poorer, more frightened land that traded with almost no one because there was almost no one left to trade with. The great irony of the entire collapse is sitting right here in Egypt's survival. The one power that lived was hollowed out by the very catastrophe it survived. It won the war and lost the world. It held the border and could not hold the future. And in a way, the slow death of victorious Egypt is more haunting than the fast death of burning Ugarit, because it shows us the second face of collapse, not the dramatic one, the fire and the wave, but the quiet one, the long fade, the empire that does not fall so much as it slowly forgets how to be itself. Both faces were the same disease, the wave and the strike. the burning port and the unpaid worker, the arrow in the delta and the looted tomb. All of it was the connected world coming apart, expressed in 100 different local accents, in 100 different cities, over the course of a few decades that changed the shape of human history forever. By the time it was over, by the time the dust settled and the fires went cold, and the last desperate letters had stopped being written, the world that we spent the first part of this story building, the world of the brother kings and the trade ships and the girl in the citadel watching for the sails, that entire world was simply gone. Not reduced, not diminished, gone. In the way a fire-cleared forest is gone, leaving the survivors to crawl out into a landscape they did not recognize, in a poorer and harder and lonelier age that we have given a name that says everything about how far the light had fallen. We call it a dark age, and to understand what that darkness actually meant, to understand what it is like to live in the long shadow of a collapse, generations after the fires, we have to follow the survivors out of the ruins, into the silence that came after. Because the silence, in some ways, is the most frightening part of the entire story. Imagine being born into the after. You never saw the cities when they lived. You never saw the harbors full of masts, or the storerooms heavy with oil, or the scribes pressing words into clay. All of that ended before your grandparents were born. You have only the ruins, and you live among them, the way a small creature lives in the shell of something vastly larger that died long ago. The great walls are still there. That is the strangest part. The fortifications of the old citadels did not burn. Stone does not burn. So you grow up in the shadow of these impossible walls, made of blocks so enormous that 10 men together could not lift a single one of them. And you ask the only question a child can ask, looking up at them. Who built this? And nobody knows. That is the heart of the Dark Age, the thing that makes it genuinely dark. The knowledge is gone. Not just the wealth, not just the kings, but the memory itself. The people living among the ruins of the old world had lost the ability to understand the old world. They could see the walls, but they could not imagine the civilization that raised them, because that civilization was so much greater than anything they now knew that it had passed beyond the edge of belief. And so they did the thing humans always do when the truth becomes unbelievable. They reached for a story. They decided the walls had been built by giants, by a race of one-eyed monsters out of legend, strong enough to stack mountains. That is the only explanation that fit, the only way to make sense of the evidence in front of their eyes. Ordinary people could not have done this. Therefore, it was not ordinary people. It was giants, in the time before, in the age of monsters and heroes that was definitely not real and definitely not them. Sit with the full horror of that for a moment. These were the descendants of the very people who built those walls. The blood of the wall builders ran in their veins, and they had fallen so far, lost so much, that they could no longer recognize the achievement of their own ancestors as a human achievement at all. They looked at what their great-great-grandparents had made and concluded it must have been the work of monsters, because the alternative, that people like them had once been capable of that, had become literally inconceivable. That is what a dark age is. It is not just poverty. It is not just the loss of cities and trade. It is the loss of the very memory of having been more, until the past becomes a foreign country, a myth, a fairy tale you tell your children about a time that surely never really happened. And the deepest cut, the loss that more than any other defines the darkness, is this: they forgot how to write. Think about that. The world that collapsed had been a literate world, a world of scribes and archives and records, where a queen's weavers had their names written down, where kings exchanged letters across the sea, where the business of states was carried out in clay, and the accounts of palaces were kept in careful script. Writing was everywhere in the old world, woven into the fabric of how it functioned. And then, in the regions hit hardest by the collapse, writing simply stopped. The script that the Mycenaeans had used to keep their palace records vanished completely. For something like 400 years, 4 centuries, longer than the time between us and the founding of the oldest nations many of us live in, there was no writing at all in that part of the world. 400 years of silence. 400 years in which not a single name, not a single law, not a single love letter or shopping list or king's boast was written down, because there was no longer anyone who knew how. The skill had not just fallen out of use, it had died, like a language with no last speakers, taking with it the entire memory of everyone who lived and died inside those 4 centuries. We have almost nothing from them, no records, no documents, no words in their own voice. They lived and loved and feared and hoped and died, generation after generation, and they left no writing, because writing had become a lost art, a thing the giants used to do, back in the time before. Here is what that means, and it is one of the most sobering facts in all of human history. Civilization is not a ratchet. It does not only click forward. We tend to assume that progress accumulates, that what one generation learns, the next will inherit, that the line of human achievement only ever rises. But the Dark Age proves that the line can fall, and not just fall, but fall so far that a people can lose the ability to read, lose the memory of their own greatness, lose so much that they mistake their ancestors for monsters. Knowledge can be unlearned, skills can be forgotten, the light can go out and stay out for centuries. And yet, the survivors did not stop being human. In the long silence of the Dark Age, around their fires, in the dark, they did the thing humans have always done when the lights go out. They told stories. They could not write anymore, so the stories had to live in memory and in the spoken word, passed from mouth to mouth, parent to child, singer to singer, across all those centuries of silence. And the stories they told were about the time before, the lost golden age, the time of the great walls and the bronze heroes, the time when men were greater than men could be now. The stories drifted and changed and grew, the way all spoken stories do, gathering gods and monsters and impossible deeds, until the real history at their core was buried under centuries of telling. But the core was real. Underneath the gods and the monsters, the singers in the dark were preserving a memory of the world that had collapsed, a memory of great kings and a great war and a great city that burned. When writing finally returned to that part of the world, centuries later, and it returned in a new and revolutionary form, which we will come to because it changed everything. Among the very first things that were written down were those ancient spoken stories, the tales the singers had carried through the darkness. And so the memory of the lost Bronze Age survived, not in the careful records of its own scribes, which had burned, but in legend, in the great epic poems about heroes and gods and a city that fell, poems we still read today, poems that begin with the rage of one warrior and the sailing of 1,000 ships. We read those poems as mythology, as stories, as the imaginative invention of a poet. But they are something stranger and more precious than that. They are the echo of a real catastrophe, transmitted across 400 years of darkness by people who could no longer write. The cultural memory of a collapse so total that the only way it could survive was as a song. When we read about the heroes of the bronze and the great walled city that burned, we are listening, across 3,000 years, to the survivors of the end of the Bronze Age, trying to remember what they lost. The poems are a kind of letter, too, like the one in the kiln, a message from the dead who could not write it down themselves, sent forward through the only medium they had left, the human voice, refusing to forget. But do not let the beauty of the surviving songs soften the truth of what happened. For every story that survived, 10,000 were lost. For every memory the singers carried, an ocean of memory drowned in the silence. The names of almost everyone who lived in the old world are gone forever, not because they were unimportant, but because the thing that recorded names had been destroyed, and the people who came after could not write the names down even if they had known them. An entire literate civilization was returned to silence, and most of what it knew and felt and was went into the dark with it and never came back. The harbors stayed empty. The trade routes stayed broken. The population shrank, in some regions dramatically, as people died or fled or simply failed to be born in a world that could no longer feed as many of them. The great cities were not rebuilt. People lived in their ruins, smaller and poorer and fewer, herding animals through the broken streets of ports that had once welcomed the ships of the world. The connections that had defined the old age were severed, and the survivors withdrew into small, local, self-sufficient lives, into the very isolation that the great connected world had once seemed to make obsolete forever. It is tempting to think of all this as simply sad, a tragedy, a fall, a darkness. And it was. But there is another way to see it, a harder and more important way, and we are going to need it for the final movements of this story. Because the people who lived through the collapse and into the Dark Age were not just victims of an ending. They were also, without knowing it, the seed of a beginning. The world that died was magnificent, but it was also rigid, top-heavy, dependent, brittle. A world of god-kings and palace economies and long, fragile chains of supply. A world that could be killed all at once, precisely because it was all connected to the same few points of failure. What grew up afterward, slowly, in the ashes, would be something different. Harder, lonelier at first, but also, in ways no one in the burning cities could have imagined, freer. The collapse was an ending, but endings, in history, are almost never only endings. And before we can understand what was being born in the dark, before we can understand the strange new world that would rise from the ruins, and the revolutionary technology, and the revolutionary idea that would come with it, we have to stop and ask the question that has haunted this entire story from the very first words. The question we have been circling, gathering evidence for, narrowing down, all this time. Why? Why did it all happen? Why did an entire interconnected world die, almost all at once, in the space of a single human lifetime? Because the answer is not what most people expect. And the answer, when we finally assemble it, is going to point a long finger directly across 3,000 years and aim it straight at us. For more than 100 years, the people who study this collapse have been trying to name the killer. And the strange, frustrating, ultimately profound thing is that every time they thought they had found it, the evidence refused to let the case close. Let us go through the suspects the way a detective would, one at a time, because the failure of each one, on its own, is what finally reveals the terrible truth. The first suspect is the Earth itself. Across the lands that collapsed, there is a band of territory that sits along some of the most seismically active fault lines on the planet. And when archaeologists excavated the ruined cities, they found in many of them the unmistakable signatures of earthquakes. Walls toppled in characteristic patterns, columns thrown down in the same direction, skeletons crushed beneath fallen masonry, the particular kind of destruction that the ground produces when it shakes. Some scholars propose something that sounds almost biblical, an earthquake storm. Not a single quake, but a sequence of them, a cluster of major seismic events striking the same region over a span of decades, as stress released along one fault triggered release along the next, toppling city after city in a slow geological cascade. Picture living through that. You rebuild after one quake, and a few years later the ground heaves again. Your walls, your temples, your harbor moles, the great fortifications your ancestors raised, all of it cracking and falling again and again in a generation that cannot remember a time the earth was still. It would shake more than buildings. It would shake faith. A people who believed their gods kept the world in order would watch the very ground betray them over and over and begin to wonder if the gods had abandoned them or died or never been there at all. The earthquakes were real. The destruction layers are real. But here is why the earth cannot be the killer, not on its own. Earthquakes are local, and this collapse was not. An earthquake can flatten a city, but it cannot fail the rains across an entire continent, cannot empty the Hittite granaries, cannot send whole peoples migrating across the sea, cannot make writing itself disappear for 400 years. Earthquakes can knock down a wounded civilization. They cannot wound the whole world at once. The Earth was an accomplice. It was not the murderer. The second suspect we have already met, the drought. The failing rains, the shrinking harvests, the long climatic drying out written into the lake beds and the cave stone and the tree rings. And the case against the drought is strong, much stronger than the case against the Earth. The climate evidence is real and widespread. The famine is documented in the desperate letters. The timing fits, and drought has the one quality the earthquakes lack: reach. A long regional climate shift can touch every kingdom at once, can empty granaries and break trade, and tear loose migrating peoples all across the connected world simultaneously. Of all the single suspects, the drought is the most plausible. But even the drought cannot stand alone as the answer, and the reason why is one of the most important ideas in this entire story. Because civilizations have survived droughts before. Egypt's whole existence was a long negotiation with the sometimes cruel climate. Societies build buffers, granaries, reservoirs, trade relationships, the accumulated wisdom of surviving hard years. A drought, even a long one, is something a healthy civilization can weather. The drought was not an unprecedented event. What was unprecedented was the state of the world the drought arrived in. And that brings us to the third suspect, which is not really a thing at all, but a condition: fragility. The hidden brittleness we have been tracing since the very beginning, the long, thin chains of supply, the dependence on distant tin and foreign grain, the top-heavy palace economies where everything flowed through a single ruler and a single set of storerooms, the network so tightly interconnected that no part of it could fail without straining all the others. This is the suspect that finally starts to make sense of everything, because it is not a cause so much as a vulnerability, the pre-existing condition that turns survivable shocks into a fatal disease. A healthy, resilient, self-sufficient world might have absorbed the drought, ridden out the earthquakes, fought off the migrations, and limped on. But the Bronze Age world was not resilient. It had traded resilience for efficiency, self-sufficiency for abundance, robustness for the glittering rewards of total interconnection. It had become a single vast machine, with no redundancy and no slack, optimized for good times, exquisitely vulnerable to bad ones. And so when the shocks came, the drought, the earthquakes, the migrations, the failing trade, they did not strike a sturdy structure that could take a blow. They struck a structure that had been quietly engineered, over 5 centuries of prosperity, to be exactly as fragile as possible while still standing. And it did the thing that fragile, over-connected systems do. It did not break in one place. It cascaded. This is the answer the detectives finally arrived at, after a century of hunting for a single killer. There was no single killer. There was no one cause. The end of the Bronze Age was not a murder. It was a systems collapse. A chain reaction in which multiple stresses, none of them individually fatal, struck a system that had become too interconnected and too brittle to absorb them, and brought the whole thing down together. Let me make this concrete, because it is the central insight of the whole story and everything depends on it. Imagine the connected world as a structure, where every part holds up every other part. Now start applying stress. The drought weakens the harvests. The weak harvests strain the trade. The strained trade weakens the kingdoms that lived on it. The weakened kingdoms cannot defend their borders. The undefended borders let in the migrating peoples. The migrating peoples burn the trade cities. The burned trade cities break the supply of metals. The broken metal supply cripples the armies that needed bronze. The crippled armies cannot hold against the next wave. The next wave breaks another kingdom. The broken kingdom severs another set of connections. And every single one of these failures makes every other failure more likely, until the whole interconnected world is feeding its own collapse, each falling piece knocking over the next, faster and faster, in a cascade that no king and no god and no army could stop. Because the thing that was collapsing was not any single kingdom, but the connections between all of them. That is why, There is no victor's account. That is why the writing just stops. That is why we find abandoned cities and unfired tablets and no triumphant conqueror to explain it. Because nobody conquered the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age collapsed under its own weight, pulled down by the very network that had been its greatest achievement. The thing that made it magnificent was the thing that killed it. The connection was the strength, and the connection was the fatal flaw, and they were never two things. They were always, from the very first trade ship, the same single thing. And there is one more dimension to this, the most human and the most overlooked, and it deserves its own place on the caseboard. Because alongside the drought and the earthquakes and the fragility, there was almost certainly something else at work, something rising up from inside the dying cities themselves. When a society built entirely on a god-king and a palace economy starts to fail, when the granaries are empty and the wages are not paid and the foreign goods stop arriving, the people inside that society begin to ask a dangerous question. They begin to ask what the palace is even for. The whole arrangement of the old world depended on a bargain. The people gave their grain and their labor to the palace, and in return, the palace stored the surplus, organized the trade, kept the order, and protected them in hard times. But when the hard times came and the palace could not deliver, when it took the grain and gave back nothing, when the god-king prayed and the rains still failed, when the great protector turned out to be powerless against the wave, the bargain broke. And a people who no longer believe in the bargain do not need an invading army to bring down the palace. They can do it themselves. We will never know how many of those burned cities were burned from the inside. How many palaces fell not to the sea peoples, but to their own starving subjects, who looked at the storehouses and the foreign luxuries and the priests and the god-king who could not save them, and decided they had had enough. The collapse may have been, in part, a revolution, 1,000 small uprisings against a system that had stopped working, the desperate and the abandoned tearing down a world that had abandoned them. The same hunger that drove the migrating peoples from the outside may have been turning the survivors against their own rulers from the inside. The fire that consumed the old world may have been lit, in many places, by hands that had every reason to light it. So, assemble it all now, the full picture. The killer that was never one killer. A long drought, weakening the harvests across an entire connected world. Earthquakes, toppling the cities and shaking the people's faith. A network so brittle and interdependent that no part could fail without straining all the rest. Migrating peoples, themselves victims of the same crisis, crashing against the weakened kingdoms. And inside those kingdoms, populations losing faith in rulers who could no longer protect them, ready to finish from within what the disasters had begun from without. No single one of these would have ended the world. All of them together, striking a system optimized for fragility, in the same few decades, that ended the world. This is the answer. And notice how unsatisfying it is, in a way. How it refuses to give us a villain, a name, a single thing to blame. We want collapses to have culprits. We want a sea people's horde, a single great enemy, a clear story of attack and defense. The truth is so much more disturbing than that. The truth is that a magnificent, prosperous, deeply connected civilization can be destroyed without any single enemy at all. Destroyed by the accumulation of ordinary stresses on an extraordinary but brittle structure. Destroyed by its own success. Destroyed by the very thing that made it great. And if that idea is making the back of your neck go cold for a second time, if you are starting to feel the long finger of this story turning around and pointing somewhere closer to home, then you are understanding it correctly. Because the world that died 3,000 years ago was, in the ways that matter most, the most similar civilization to our own that had ever existed. And the way it died is the one thing about it we cannot afford to look away from. Let us follow that finger. Let us turn it all the way around. Because the last and deepest layer of this story is not about the Bronze Age at all. Before we turn that finger all the way around toward ourselves, I want to take you to one more place in the dying world. because there is a set of records that captures, more intimately than anything else that survives, what it actually felt like to live in the last days, to sense the end coming and not be able to stop it. Across the sea, in the Mycenaean world, in one of the great palace kingdoms on the Greek mainland, the scribes kept their accounts in that script that would soon vanish from the earth for 400 years. And among the very last tablets they ever wrote, tablets that were, like the ones at Ugarit, baked hard by the fire that destroyed the palace, there is a series that reads, to modern eyes, like nothing so much as the paperwork of a civilization bracing for impact. They are military records. Records of men being posted to watch the coast. Lists of units assigned to specific stretches of shoreline, of rowers and guards and watchers, of forces being deployed to the edge of the sea to look out at the water and wait. The palace was organizing its defenses. It was stationing men along the coast to watch for the ships. And it was doing this in what would turn out to be the final season of its existence. Because that same palace burned, and those same watchers failed, and the kingdom they were watching for ended. Picture being one of those watchers. Picture being posted to a lonely stretch of coast with a handful of other men, told to keep your eyes on the water, told that something is coming and your job is to see it first. You have heard the rumors. You have heard that cities to the east have fallen. You have heard the word that no one wants to say out loud, that the ships are not bringing copper anymore, that the sails on the horizon mean something new now, something that makes mothers gather their children indoors. You stand on the shore in the gray light before dawn, the cold water hissing on the stones, and you watch. And maybe, for a while, nothing comes. Maybe you stand that watch for weeks, for a whole season, and the horizon stays empty, and you start to wonder if the fear was overblown, if the end everyone whispered about will pass you by. Maybe you let yourself hope. Maybe you let yourself believe that your kingdom, your palace, your home, will be the one that is spared, because surely it cannot happen everywhere. Surely the gods will not let it reach this far. And then, one morning, the horizon is not empty. We do not have a tablet describing that morning. We have only the tablets describing the preparation for it, and then the silence after, and the layer of ash and fallen stone in between. The Watcher's last records are the records of waiting. The thing they were waiting for did not bother to write itself down. It only left the burned palace, the broken walls, the abandoned land, and the 400 years of silence that followed. The Watchers watched, and the end came anyway, and no one ever wrote down how it felt to finally see the sails appear, because the people who saw them did not survive to write it, and the people who came after could not write at all. This is what the collapse looked like across the Mycenaean world. Not one fall, but many. The great fortress palaces burning one after another, the population scattering, the proud warrior kingdoms that had buried their dead in masks of gold simply ceasing to exist. The girl in the citadel we imagined at the beginning, the one who had never known hunger, who watched the horizon for the good ships, her world was among the ones that ended this way. The walls she grew up inside would still be standing 400 years later, when her distant descendants would look up at them and decide that giants must have built them. Everything in between, the painted floors, the storerooms, the names written on clay, the ships and the trade and the entire texture of her ordinary life, would be gone so completely that it would pass out of memory and into myth. And the same wave that ended her world washed up survivors on distant shores. This is one of the few places where we can actually follow the sea peoples to a destination, where the mystery resolves for once into something we can trace. Among the coalition of displaced peoples who crashed against Egypt and were turned back from the river, some of them did not simply vanish. They settled. Driven from wherever they had come, beaten back from the one great power that held, they came to rest along the coast of the Levant. And there they put down roots, built towns, became a people with a land. The land took its name from them. It is a name that has echoed down through 3,000 years of history, a name still attached to that stretch of the world today. The wandering, the burning, the desperate migration of a displaced people ended, for some of them, in becoming a settled nation that left a permanent mark on the map. There is something almost gentle in that, amid all the destruction. The Sea Peoples were not just a force of annihilation. They were also people looking for a home, and some of them, in the end, found one. The collapse did not only erase. In places, it relocated. It took peoples from one part of the dying world and deposited them in another, mixing the survivors, scrambling the old map, planting the seeds of nations that had not existed before. The wave that ended so many worlds also carried fragments of those worlds to new shores, where they would take root and grow into something the old age had never seen. Because here is the thing we have not yet fully faced, the turn that the second half of this story has been building toward. We have spent all this time on the ending, the fires, the famines, the burning ports, the silence, the loss. And the ending was real, and it was vast, and most of what it destroyed never came back. But a collapse is not the same as an extinction. The people did not all die. The world did not become empty. The survivors crawled out into the ruins, and they kept living, kept having children, kept telling stories, kept being human. And over the long centuries of darkness, in the cleared and broken landscape of the old world, something genuinely new began to grow. The old world had to die for the new one to be born. That is the hardest and most important truth in this entire story. And it is the one we have been circling toward from the beginning. Because the very things that made the new world possible, the things that would eventually carry humanity further than the Bronze Age ever dreamed of going, could only emerge in the space that the collapse cleared away. To understand that, we have to go back to the metal. We have to go back to bronze itself, to the alloy that named the age, the recipe of copper and distant tin, the thread that ran across the whole world and could be so easily cut. Because the collapse did something to that thread that nobody planned and nobody wanted, and the consequence of it would change human history more profoundly than any king or any battle ever did. The tin stopped coming. And when the tin stopped coming, humanity was forced to find another way. The crisis that ended one age became the labor pains of the next. For all the centuries of the Bronze Age, iron was not unknown. People had seen it, they had occasionally worked it, usually iron that fell from the sky, in meteorites, treated as a rare and almost magical material, too precious and too strange for everyday use. But iron from the ground, iron smelted from ore, was a different matter. It is harder to work than bronze. It requires much higher temperatures, more skill, more patience. And in a world where bronze flowed freely along the great trade routes, where copper came in by the shipload and tin arrived from the ends of the earth, there was simply no reason to bother with the difficult new metal. Bronze was easier, and bronze was everywhere. Why struggle with iron when the old recipe worked so well? The collapse answered that question. When the trade routes broke, the tin stopped coming, and without tin, there could be no bronze. The metal that had armed the entire civilized world, the metal that named the age, suddenly could not be made, because half of its recipe came from 1,000 miles away along a road that no longer existed. A smith in the ruins of the old world could still find copper, perhaps, but the tin was gone, severed by the same cascade that had burned the cities and emptied the granaries. The age of bronze was ending not just figuratively, but literally, chemically, in the cooling forges of a world that had lost the ability to make its own defining material. And so, out of pure necessity, out of the desperate need to make tools and weapons in a world where the old way was no longer possible, humanity turned to the harder path. They learned to master iron. And here is the quiet revolution buried inside that grim necessity. Tin had been rare, distant, controllable, a resource that flowed through a few hands along a few routes, a resource that kings and trade networks could monopolize, a resource whose scarcity was woven into the very structure of Bronze Age power. Iron ore was nothing like that. Iron ore is one of the most common substances in the crust of the earth. It is almost everywhere. You do not need a 1,000-mile trade route to find iron. You do not need to be part of a vast interconnected network of brother kings. You can find iron ore close to home, in your own land, and if you have the skill, you can make your own metal without depending on anyone. Do you feel what that does to the world? The Old Age had been built on scarcity and dependence, on the fact that the essential metal could only be made by participating in a fragile global system. The New Age would be built on something closer to abundance and independence, on a metal that ordinary communities could produce for themselves. Without god kings, without palace economies, without the long, thin chains of supply that had strangled the old world to death. The collapse did not just kill the Bronze Age. It killed the entire model of civilization that the Bronze Age represented, the top-heavy, centralized, dependent model, and replaced it with something more distributed, more local, more resilient. A world that makes its tools from a metal that comes from 1,000 miles away is a world that can be killed by cutting a single road. A world that makes its tools from a metal found in its own hills is much harder to kill. The survivors of the collapse, without ever intending to, built a tougher kind of civilization, one less vulnerable to the exact catastrophe that had destroyed their ancestors. They had learned the lesson written in the ashes, even if they could not have put it into words. Do not depend on a single distant thread for the thing you cannot live without. But the deeper revolution, the one that would matter most of all, was not about metal. It was about writing. Remember what was lost. Remember the 400 years of silence, the script that vanished, the people who forgot how to write and decided their ancestors must have been giants. The old writing systems of the Bronze Age had been extraordinary, but they had also been monstrously complicated. Hundreds of signs, sometimes more, each one a symbol that had to be memorized, a system so difficult that only a tiny class of professional scribes could ever master it. Writing in the old world was not a skill ordinary people had. It was a closely held craft, the property of palace officials and temple scribes, a kind of secret power that the literate few held over the illiterate many. And when the collapse killed the scribes and burned the schools and broke the institutions that trained them, the whole skill simply died, because it had been concentrated in too few hands. A thing that only specialists can do can be lost when the specialists are lost. What rose in the cleared ground was something profoundly, radically different. Among the survivors of the collapse, the trading peoples of the Levantine coast, the descendants of those cosmopolitan merchant cities, someone, or some series of someones, did one of the most important things any human being has ever done. They simplified writing. Instead of hundreds of signs standing for words and syllables, they reduced writing to a tiny set of symbols, a couple of dozen, each one standing for a single basic sound. A handful of letters that, combined and recombined, could spell out any word in the language. It was the alphabet. And the genius of it, the world-changing power of it, was that it was simple enough for almost anyone to learn. You no longer needed years of training in a scribal school. You no longer needed to be part of a privileged caste. With a few dozen letters, an ordinary person could learn to read and write in a fraction of the time the old systems demanded. Think about what that meant. Writing, the technology of memory, the technology that lets a thought outlive the person who thought it. The technology that lets a civilization accumulate knowledge across generations was taken out of the locked hands of the few and given, in principle, to everyone. The trading peoples who developed it carried it along their sea routes to every shore they touched, and it spread, and it was adapted, and it became the ancestor of nearly every alphabet used on Earth today. The letters you are reading right now, in whatever language you are reading them, are the distant descendants of that simplification. a tool forged by the survivors of the Bronze Age collapse in the long dark after the old world died. And there is a beautiful, almost unbearable symmetry in this. The old world died, in part, because it had concentrated everything in too few points, too few trade routes, too few sources of tin, too few scribes, too much dependence on a fragile center. And the new world, learning from the ruins, distributed everything more widely, iron from everywhere, writing for everyone, power spread out instead of piled up. The collapse was a teacher, and its lesson was written in fire. What is concentrated can be lost all at once. What is distributed endures. So look at what grew in the space the collapse cleared. New peoples, who had been minor or unknown in the old world, rose into the light. The trading peoples of the coast spread their alphabet and their commerce across the entire Mediterranean, founding colonies on distant shores. Other peoples in the hills and the inland valleys coalesced into new nations with new ideas, including ideas about gods and law and human worth that would echo through the next 3,000 years and shape the spiritual life of half the planet. And eventually, after the centuries of silence, the descendants of the burned Mycenaean world would learn to write again, using the new alphabet, and the very first things they would write down would be those ancient stories the singers had carried through the dark, the songs of the heroes and the great war and the city that burned. The memory of the lost age, finally fixed in the new writing, preserved forever in the very technology that the collapse had made possible. The old world had to burn for any of this to happen. That is the part that should unsettle us, the part that resists every comforting story we like to tell about progress. The alphabet, the iron, the new peoples, the new ideas, the foundations of the world we still live in, none of it could have grown in the shade of the great Bronze Age canopy. The old order was too dominant, too entrenched, too good at being what it was. It had to fall. The forest had to burn down to the ground before anything new could find the light. And the people who lived through the burning experienced none of the renewal. They experienced only the fire, only the loss, only the end. The new growth was for their descendants, generations later, who would never know the names of the ones who suffered through the dark so that they could inherit the cleared ground. This is one of the cruelest patterns in all of history, and the Bronze Age collapse shows it more clearly than almost anything else. The people who pay the price of a collapse, and the people who reap the benefits of what grows afterward, are never the same people. The scribe in the burning kiln did not get an alphabet. The watchers on the coast did not get iron tools. The girl in the citadel did not get a new and freer world. They got the ending. The beginning belonged to people they would never meet, who would never know their names, who would look at the walls their ancestors built and think them the work of giants. And so we have followed the whole arc, from the golden peace of the brother kings, to the fire and the silence, to the slow, strange rebirth. We understand, as well as anyone can, what was lost and what was eventually born. We have named the killers and found that there was no single killer. We have stood in the burning port and the abandoned capital and the delta of the desperate battle. But there is one more turn left, the deepest one, the one this entire story has been quietly aiming at since the very first words about the kiln. Because the more clearly we see the world that died, the connected world, the fragile world, the world that mistook efficiency for safety and abundance for security and connection for permanence, the more clearly we are looking at something that should be impossible for us to look at without flinching. We are looking at ourselves. But before we hold up that mirror, there is a question we have been avoiding. The most human question of all. The one that sits underneath every collapse and refuses to be answered cleanly. How did they not see it coming? How do you live through the end of your entire world and not know, until it is far too late, that it is ending? We ask it from the outside, from 3,000 years away, where we can see the whole shape of it laid out like a map. The drought building, the trade fraying, the migrations gathering, the cascade approaching. From up here, it looks obvious. It looks like a slow-motion catastrophe that anyone should have been able to see. And we are tempted to feel superior to the people who lived through it, to imagine that we, in their place, would have noticed, would have prepared, would have done something. That is the comforting lie we tell ourselves about every disaster in history. They were blind. We would have seen. But put yourself inside one of their lives, honestly, and the comforting lie falls apart. You are not born at the end of the Bronze Age. Nobody is born at the end of anything. You are born somewhere in the middle of a long, slow unraveling that no one has a name for yet, because it is still happening, because it will not be named until long after everyone alive is dead. The drought does not announce itself as the beginning of the end. It announces itself as a bad year. And bad years happen. Your parents lived through bad years. The granaries are a little lower than usual, the harvest a little thinner. But it has been thin before, and the rains have always come back before. And so you assume they will come back again. You adjust. You tighten your belt. You tell yourself it is temporary. Because, in your entire experience, hard times have always been temporary. The trade slows, but it does not stop all at once. The ships come a little less often. A familiar merchant does not return one season, and there are rumors about why, but rumors are always flying, and most of them are nonsense. The prices rise, the foreign goods become harder to find, but you can still get them, if you pay more. And so the world still basically works, still basically looks like the world you have always known. The changes are real, but they are gradual, and the human mind is exquisitely good at adjusting to gradual change, at accepting each new diminished normal as simply normal, at never quite noticing the moment when the water that has been slowly heating around you becomes the water that is going to kill you. This is the cruelest mechanism of collapse, and it has nothing to do with intelligence or foresight. It is built into the very nature of how human beings experience time. We live forward, day by day, inside the small frame of our own lives. We cannot see the long curve from inside it. The girl in the citadel does not know she is living in the last generation, because to her, it is not the last generation. It is just her life, the only life she has ever known, full of ordinary mornings and ordinary worries, the citadel as solid as it has always been, the future as open as it has always seemed. There is no morning when she wakes up and is told, "This is the beginning of the end of your world." There is only a long series of ordinary mornings, each one slightly worse than the last, until one of them is the last, and by then it is far too late to have done anything differently. And even when the signs become impossible to ignore, even when the cities to the east have visibly fallen, and the refugees are on the roads, and the watchers are posted on the coast, there is another force that holds people in place, a force more powerful than fear. It is hope. It is the desperate, reasonable, deeply human belief that it will not happen here, that whatever is destroying other places will, somehow, spare this one, that our walls are higher, our gods stronger, our king wiser, our luck better. People do not flee their homes the moment danger appears on the horizon, because to flee is to give up everything, your house, your land, your ancestors' graves, your entire life, on the gamble that the danger is real and unstoppable. And so people wait. They wait for certainty. They wait to be sure. And by the time they are sure, the certainty is the enemy in the harbor, and there is no longer anywhere to flee to. We can actually see this denial frozen in the evidence. The unfired tablets in the kiln at the burning port, the scribe still recording the ordinary business of the state as the fire approached. The watcher's tablets across the sea, a kingdom organizing its defenses with bureaucratic care right up until the moment that bureaucracy and everything it served was reduced to ash. These are not the records of people who knew the world was ending. These are the records of people who were still, on the very last day, doing the ordinary work of a world they assumed would continue. They were paying the watchers. They were filing the accounts. They were keeping the machine running, because keeping the machine running was the only thing they knew how to do. And because to stop would have been to admit something no human being wants to admit, that the world you were born into, the world you assumed was permanent, the world that was simply the way things are, is mortal and is dying, and there is nothing you can do to save it. There is a particular kind of grief in that, a grief we do not have a good name for. It is the grief of watching not a person die, but a world. The girl in the citadel, if she lived long enough, did not just lose her family or her home. She lost the entire framework of reality she had grown up inside. The trade, the ships, the writing, the kings, the gods who were supposed to keep order, the whole structure of meaning that told her who she was and how the world worked. She watched all of it become uncertain, then unreliable, then impossible. And there was no one to explain it to her, because no one understood it, because it had never happened before in living memory, because the people best equipped to make sense of the world were exactly the scribes and priests and kings whose authority was collapsing along with everything else. Imagine being old in those years. Imagine being someone who remembered the good times, the full harbors, the abundant harvests, the confident kings, the world working the way it was supposed to work, and living long enough to watch all of it come apart. Imagine trying to explain to your grandchildren what it had been like, the ships and the gold and the foreign wonders, and seeing in their faces that they did not quite believe you, that to them your stories sounded like fairy tales, like exaggerations, like the way old people always insist things used to be better. Imagine being the living memory of a world that the next generation would only know as legend. You would be the bridge between the real Golden Age and the myth of the Golden Age, and you would feel it slipping out of your hands even as you tried to pass it on. And then imagine dying. Imagine being one of the last people who actually remembered, carrying the true and detailed memory of the lost world down into the grave with you, because there was no longer any writing to fix it in place, no longer any institution to preserve it. Nothing but the failing memories of a few old survivors and the songs that would slowly drift from history into myth. Every person who died in those dark generations took a piece of the truth with them, irretrievably, and the sum of all those small private losses was the great forgetting. The reason that an entire literate, sophisticated, interconnected civilization could pass so completely out of human knowledge that its own descendants would forget it had ever existed. So the answer to the question, how did they not see it coming, is not that they were foolish. It is that no one, ever, in any age, gets to see their own world from the outside. We are all the girl in the citadel. We are all living forward through ordinary mornings, adjusting to each new normal, hoping it will not happen here, keeping the machine running, certain that the world we were born into is simply the way things are. The people of the Bronze Age were not blind. They were human, and being human means living inside a story whose ending you cannot read, because you are a sentence in it, and sentences do not get to see the final page. Which is precisely why their story should frighten us, not because we are foolish and they were wise, or because we are wise and they were foolish, but because we are exactly the same. We have the same minds, the same blind spots, the same talent for accepting gradual decline as normal, the same hope that it will not happen here, the same inability to see our own world from the outside. The only real difference between them and us is that we have their story to look at. We have the map they never had. We can see, laid out before us, the complete anatomy of how a magnificent, prosperous, deeply interconnected civilization can come apart. Not from a single catastrophe, but from the accumulation of ordinary stresses on a structure that had grown too brittle to bend. We have the warning. The only question is whether having it makes any difference at all. And to ask that question honestly, we finally have to turn and look, really look, at the world we have built. Because the resemblance is not vague, and it is not comforting. The resemblance is precise, and it is the most important thing this entire story has to tell us. Look at the thing in your hand. The device you might be holding right now. The one that more than anything else defines the age we live in. Inside it is a small piece of engineering so sophisticated that no single nation on Earth can produce it alone. Its design might come from one country, its rare components mined in another, its most advanced parts manufactured in a handful of specialized facilities in just one or two places on the entire planet, assembled in yet another country, using materials that passed through a dozen hands across a dozen borders before they ever came together in your palm. It is the oxhide ingot of our age. It is the bronze of the 21st century. And like bronze, its essential ingredients are not found together, are not controlled by the people who use them, and depend for their existence on a chain of trade so long and so intricate that no single human being can see all of it at once. We did exactly what they did. We built a magnificent, prosperous, globally interconnected world, and we built it on the same foundation, on the trade of essential things across vast distances, on the deep interdependence of nations that need each other to function, on the quiet assumption that the routes will stay open and the ships will keep moving and the system will simply continue, because it always has, because it is simply the way things are now. We have our rare metals that come from only a few places. We have our specialized facilities that the whole world depends on. We have our long, thin chains of supply, optimized not for resilience but for efficiency, for getting the most out of the system in good times with the least slack, the least redundancy, the least margin for when things go wrong. We even have a name for the philosophy. We call it just in time. We deliberately remove the buffers, the warehouses full of spare parts, the strategic reserves, because buffers are expensive and inefficient and, in good times, unnecessary. We optimize the slack out of the system, exactly the way the Bronze Age optimized self-sufficiency out of its world, for exactly the same reason. Because abundance and efficiency are intoxicating, and because when everything is working, the safety margins look like waste. And then, not long ago, the whole world got a small, sharp lesson in what happens when a single thread in that system is pulled. A disruption in one place, a factory closed, a port jammed, a route blocked, and suddenly people on the other side of the planet could not buy the things they needed. Shelves emptied, prices spiked. Industries that depended on a single distant supplier ground to a halt because that one supplier had stopped. We discovered, briefly and uncomfortably, that our interconnected world has the same hidden fragility the Bronze Age had, that a problem in one node can cascade across the entire network, that we are all, in ways most of us never think about, utterly dependent on the smooth functioning of systems we did not build, do not understand, and cannot control. We got a small taste, the Bronze Age got the full meal, and the parallels do not stop at trade. Look at the other threads. The Bronze Age was brought down in part by a changing climate, by a long shift in the weather that broke the harvests across an entire connected world at once. We are living through our own changing climate, and we know it, and we can measure it with a precision the Bronze Age could never have dreamed of, and yet we find ourselves caught in the same psychological trap as the girl in the citadel, adjusting to each new normal, telling ourselves it is gradual, hoping it will not happen here, certain that our walls are high enough. We have the data they never had. Whether that makes any difference is the open question of our age. The Bronze Age was destabilized by mass movements of desperate people, themselves driven from their homes by forces beyond their control. Our age too knows the movement of millions of the displaced, and knows how the strain of it can fracture the politics of the places they move toward, and knows that the pressures driving people from their homes are not decreasing. The Bronze Age suffered from the loss of faith in rulers who could no longer deliver on the old bargain, the storehouses that stood empty, the protectors who could not protect. And we too live in an age of eroding trust in institutions, of populations losing faith that the systems they live under are working for them, of the slow, corrosive doubt that can hollow out a society from within, long before any external blow ever lands. None of this is prophecy. Let me be clear about that, because it would be cheap and false to stand here and predict our doom. We are not the Bronze Age. We have things they never had: science, medicine, the accumulated knowledge of all of recorded history, the ability to see our own situation in a way no previous civilization ever could. We have writing that cannot be lost in a single generation, knowledge stored in 1,000 places, a memory that does not depend on a handful of fragile scribes. We are more resilient in some ways than any civilization that has ever existed. The story of the Bronze Age is not a prediction that we will fall. It is something more subtle and more useful, and in a way more haunting than a prediction. It is a mirror, and the value of a mirror is not that it tells your future. The value of a mirror is that it shows you what you actually are, right now, if you are brave enough to look. And what the mirror shows is this: that complexity and connection, the very things we are proudest of, the very things that have made our world rich beyond the dreams of any previous age, are the same things that carry within them the seeds of fragility. That a civilization can be magnificent and doomed at the same time. That the height of prosperity and the approach of collapse are not opposites. They can be, and in the Bronze Age they demonstrably were, the same moment seen from two different distances. The brother kings at the peak of their golden peace were also the brother kings standing at the edge of the abyss, and they could not tell the difference, because from inside a golden age, the edge of the abyss looks exactly like more golden age. This is the thought that should stay with us, the one the Bronze Age paid such a terrible price to teach. Not that we are about to fall. We may not be, and there is much we can do, and despair is just another way of refusing to look clearly. But that we are not exempt, that the rules which governed their collapse are the same rules that govern us, because they are rules about the nature of complex, interconnected, brittle systems, and our system, for all its glories, is more complex, more interconnected, and in some ways more brittle than theirs ever was. The lesson is not that collapse is coming. The lesson is that collapse is possible, that it has happened before, to people who were just as certain of their permanence as we are of ours, and that the only thing that ever protects a civilization from it is the willingness to see the fragility clearly and build in the resilience that efficiency keeps trying to strip away. The Bronze Age forgot that. Or rather, it never learned it, because it had never needed to. It had no previous great collapse to study, no map of the abyss, no warning written in fire by an earlier world. It walked toward the edge blind, because it was the first to walk there, and it fell, and its falling became the warning that every civilization since has had the option of heeding or ignoring. We are the inheritors of that warning. We are the first civilization in history sophisticated enough to fully understand what happened to them, to read their last letters, to map their trade routes, to model their climate, to diagnose their collapse. We have done the autopsy. We know exactly how this kind of world dies. The only thing we do not know is whether knowing makes any difference. And maybe that is the final mystery of this story. Not why the Bronze Age fell, which we have answered as well as it can be answered, but whether the answer can save anyone. Whether a civilization can look directly at the corpse of an earlier world that died exactly the way it is built to die and change course. Or whether knowledge, in the end, is not enough. Whether the same forces that blinded the girl in the citadel will blind us too, no matter how clearly we have seen, because seeing and acting are not the same thing, and a warning unheeded is the same as no warning at all. We do not get to know the answer. We are sentences in our own story, and we cannot read the final page. The people who will know whether we heeded the warning are not yet born. They will look back at us the way we look back at the Bronze Age, with the terrible clarity of hindsight, seeing the whole shape of our age laid out like a map, perhaps wondering how we did not see what was so obvious, perhaps marveling that we saw it and acted anyway, perhaps mourning, perhaps grateful. We will be their lesson, the way the Bronze Age is ours. And we have exactly as much control over how that lesson reads as the Brother Kings had over how theirs would read to us. Which is to say, some, not none, and not all. The Bronze Age could not have prevented the drought or the earthquakes, but it might have built a less brittle world. It might have kept some slack in the system, some redundancy in the supply, some self-sufficiency against the day the threads were cut. It did not, because in the good times, resilience always looks like waste, and the future always feels like more of the present. That was the choice they made without knowing they were making it. And it is the same choice we are making, every day, without quite admitting that it is a choice at all. The kiln is still warm, in a sense. The fire that baked those last tablets is still teaching us, 3,000 years later, if we are willing to learn. The scribe who kept writing as the world ended left us a message after all. Not the message he intended, not the routine business of a doomed city, but a deeper one, written between the lines of every word he pressed into that clay. The message is simply this: it can end. Everything you think is permanent can end. The world that feels like the natural order of things is not the natural order of things. It is a structure, built by human hands, held up by connections you cannot see, and it can come down. He did not know he was writing that, but it is the truest thing in the tablet. But I do not want to leave them as a lesson. That is the danger of standing too far back, of turning a world full of people into a cautionary diagram for our own benefit. They were not a warning to us. They did not live and suffer and die so that we could extract a moral from their ruins. They were people, as real and as present to themselves as we are to ourselves. And before we close this story, we owe them the dignity of being seen as more than a mirror. So let us go back into the world one last time, and this time, let us notice something we have rushed past in our hurry toward the great collapse. Not everyone died. Not every place burned. The catastrophe was vast, but it was not uniform, and the pattern of who survived and who did not is one of the most revealing things in the entire story, because it tells us something true and unsettling about what actually kept people alive when the world came apart. Think about the great powers we have followed. The empire of the stone lions in the high north, gone, abandoned, its capital emptied and burned. The cosmopolitan trading ports of the coast, gone, the most spectacularly and completely destroyed of all. The proud fortress kingdoms across the sea, gone, their walls left to the giants of legend. And yet, far to the east, in the ancient heartland between the great rivers, the picture was different. The old kingdom of Babylon was battered, it suffered, it was raided, dynasties fell. But the deep, ancient civilization of the river valleys did not vanish. It contracted, it bled, it changed hands, but it endured. And its neighbor, a hard kingdom of warriors that would one day rise to terrify the entire region, weathered the storm in diminished form and survived to fight another day. Why? Why did the river kingdoms of the east survive while the trading cities of the coast were erased from existence? The answer takes us right back to the heart of everything. The kingdoms that survived were, in general, the ones that were less dependent on the great connected system, the ones that grew their own food in their own fertile valleys, that did not live or die by the flow of distant trade, that had a deep agricultural base and a self-sufficient core that could keep functioning even when the wider world fell apart around them. They were anchored to the land. They were rooted in something that could not be cut by a blockade or a burned port or a severed trade route. When the network died, they could fall back on themselves because they had a self to fall back on. The places that died most completely were the places that had bet everything on connection, the trading ports that grew nothing and made nothing, and lived entirely on the movement of other people's goods. The palace economies so specialized, so dependent on imports, so optimized for their role in the great machine that when the machine stopped, they had nothing left. No fields they could fall back on, no self-sufficiency they had bothered to maintain, nothing but a perfect adaptation to a world that no longer existed. The most modern, most sophisticated, most connected places were the most fragile. The old-fashioned, rooted, self-sufficient places were the ones that endured. Sit with how counterintuitive that is, and how important. In the good times, the trading ports would have looked like the winners, the rich, the cosmopolitan, the cutting edge, the future. The self-sufficient agricultural kingdoms would have looked old-fashioned, slow, less impressive, less wealthy. And when the test came, when the world was sorted into the living and the dead, the order reversed completely. The thing that looked like backwardness turned out to be resilience. The thing that looked like sophistication turned out to be a fatal vulnerability. Connection made you rich, and then connection killed you. Roots made you poor, and then roots saved you. And it was not only whole kingdoms that this logic sorted, it sorted people. Within the dying world, the ones most likely to survive were not the ones at the top, not the kings and the priests and the palace officials whose entire existence depended on the institution that was collapsing. When the palace burned, the king had nowhere to go. His power, his wealth, his identity, all of it was bound to a thing that no longer existed. But the farmer in the hills, the herder on the marginal land, the family that had always lived close to the earth and far from the glittering center, they had less to lose, and what they had was the one thing that mattered: the ability to feed themselves without the system. The collapse was, in a brutal way, a great leveling. It took the most from those who had the most, because they had built their lives on the very structure that failed. The high have the furthest to fall, the complex have the most to lose, and the simple, the rooted, the self-sufficient, the ones the Golden Age had quietly looked down on, inherited the broken world, because they were the only ones who could survive in it. This is a pattern that runs through every great collapse in history, and the Bronze Age shows it in its purest, starkest form. The peak of the old order was not the safest place to be standing when it fell. It was the most dangerous. And yet, and this is what makes the survivor's story so poignant rather than triumphant, surviving was not the same as being saved. The farmers and herders who lived through the collapse did not inherit a better world. They inherited a poorer, smaller, lonelier, more frightening one. They survived into the Dark Age, into the centuries of silence, into the world where the great walls stood empty and writing was forgotten and the past became myth. They did not get the Golden Age, and they did not get the eventual rebirth that their descendants would enjoy. They got the long gray middle, the hard centuries of just barely holding on, of subsistence and isolation, and the slow grinding work of staying alive in the ruins of something greater. Their reward for being resilient was the chance to keep suffering. There is no justice in that, no satisfying moral. There is only the truth of what survival actually costs, which is rarely the heroic thing we imagine, and almost always the long, unglamorous work of enduring. There is one more dimension to this, the deepest and most invisible one, and it cuts to the very meaning of what a civilization is. Because when the palaces fell, it was not only the political and economic order that collapsed, it was the spiritual one. Remember that these were peoples who built their entire understanding of reality around the gods, around the idea that the king was the link between heaven and earth, that the rituals kept the cosmos running, that the god king's holy duty was to hold back chaos and keep the world in its proper order. The whole structure of meaning, the whole answer to the question of why things are the way they are, was bound up in the institutions that were now burning. So imagine the spiritual vertigo of it. The rituals had always been performed, and the world had always held. Now the rituals were still being performed, the priests still climbing to the high places, the offerings still being made, the prayers still being said, and the world was ending anyway. The rains failed despite the prayers. The cities burned despite the gods. The king, who was supposed to be the cosmic guarantor of order, proved utterly powerless to hold back the chaos he was sworn to keep at bay. What does that do to a people's understanding of everything? When the gods who have always answered stop answering, when the order that is always held simply does not hold, when the most sacred and reliable truths of your entire civilization are exposed as helpless in the face of catastrophe. That is not just a political collapse or an economic one. It is a collapse of meaning itself. It is the floor of reality giving way.
Some of them must have lost their faith entirely, decided the gods were dead or had never been there. Some must have clung harder than ever, deciding the catastrophe was punishment, that they had not been faithful enough, that more devotion might yet save them. Some must have searched for new gods, new explanations, new frameworks to make sense of a world that the old frameworks could no longer hold. And out of that searching, in the long centuries that followed, new ways of understanding the divine would eventually emerge among the peoples who rose from the ruins. Ideas about gods who were not tied to a single city or a single king, about a moral order that did not depend on the survival of any particular palace. Ideas that would prove far more durable than the fragile temple religions of the Bronze Age, precisely because they were not bound to any structure that could burn. The collapse of the old gods cleared the ground for new ones, just as the collapse of the old metal cleared the ground for iron, and the collapse of the old writing cleared the ground for the alphabet. Everywhere you look, the same pattern: the death of the concentrated thing, the birth of the distributed thing that could survive the next catastrophe. But all of this, the survival, the resilience, the slow rebirth, the new gods and the new writing and the new world, all of it was for the future, for people not yet born. The people who lived through the end did not get any of it. They got the fire and the famine and the silence and the long forgetting. And the most astonishing thing of all, the thing that should stop us in our tracks, is that we know about them at all. By every reasonable expectation, they should have vanished completely, a world erased so thoroughly that its own descendants forgot it existed. They should have been lost forever, beyond all recovery, beyond the reach of memory. And yet here we are, 3,000 years later, speaking their names, reading their last letters, standing in their burned rooms, knowing the name of the king of the dying port, and the watchers on the distant coast, and the pharaoh who held the line at the river. How? How did a lost world claw its way back out of total oblivion? That is a story in itself, a detective story spanning 2 centuries, full of obsession and luck and brilliance and the strange, stubborn human refusal to let the dead stay silent. And it is, in its own way, the most hopeful part of this entire history. For the better part of 3,000 years, the world we have been exploring was simply gone. Not hidden, gone. The mounds where the great cities had stood were just hills, grassed over, plowed and grazed by people who had no idea what lay beneath their feet. The clay tablets, the last letters, the records of kings, they lay in the dark under tons of earth, written in scripts no living person could read, in languages no living person spoke. The temple inscriptions of the pharaoh who held the line still stood in the open air, carved in plain sight, and for thousands of years people walked past them seeing only mysterious decorations, beautiful and meaningless, the doodles of a forgotten religion. The entire civilization had not just collapsed, it had become illegible. Even where its words survived, no one alive could read them. And then, slowly, against all odds, humanity learned to listen to the dead again. It began with the scripts, with the impossible, maddening puzzle of writing that no one had been able to read for millennia. Think about what that puzzle actually demanded. You are handed marks on stone and clay, made by people whose language you do not know, whose sounds are lost, whose grammar is a mystery, with no dictionary, no teacher, no living speaker, nothing but the patterns themselves and the ferocious determination to crack them. It is one of the hardest intellectual challenges human beings have ever set themselves, to resurrect a dead language from nothing but its silent written shadow. And they did it. Across the 19th and 20th centuries, obsessive scholars, some of them famous, many of them forgotten, a few of them quite literally risking their lives to copy inscriptions off remote cliff faces,
slowly, painstakingly, broke the codes. The dense, wedge-shaped script of the ancient Near East, pressed into all those millions of clay tablets, gave up its secrets, letter by letter, word by word, until suddenly the tablets could speak. The accounts, the letters, the treaties, the desperate pleas for grain, all of it came roaring back into the light after thousands of years of silence. The brother kings could be heard again, complaining about gold. The dying ports could be heard again, begging for help. A whole lost world, restored to speech. But the most extraordinary act of resurrection, the one that should give every one of us chills, came from the script of the burned fortress kingdoms across the sea. The writing of the world that fell so completely that its descendants forgot how to read or write at all. Those clay tablets, baked hard by the fires that destroyed the palaces, sat in museums for decades, covered in a script that no one could decipher. Everyone assumed the language behind it was something exotic and lost, the tongue of a vanished people with no living relatives. It was cracked, finally, in the middle of the 20th century, and the man who cracked it was not even a professional scholar of ancient languages. He was an architect, a brilliant amateur, who treated the script as a structure to be reverse engineered, who worked at it for years as a private obsession. And when the solution finally came together, when the patterns finally resolved into sense, the revelation was so shocking that he could barely believe it himself. The lost language of the burned fortresses was Greek. An early form of it, older than the Greek of the great poems, older than anything anyone had thought possible, but unmistakably Greek. The people of the Mycenaean world, the warriors in bronze, the builders of the giant walls, had been speaking and writing an ancestor of the very same language that, centuries later, after the long darkness, after writing had been lost and then reborn, would be used to finally write down the great epic poems. The songs that the singers had carried through the 400 years of silence were sung in the descendant of the language now decoded from the tablets of the world, those very songs remembered. The line was unbroken after all. The poems and the palaces were two ends of the same thread, a thread that ran straight through the great collapse, through the darkness, through the forgetting, and survived. Imagine the moment of that decipherment. Imagine being the man who, after years of failure, suddenly realizes that the dead voices he has been straining to hear are speaking a language whose grandchild he half recognizes. That the people who built the walls the Greeks themselves believed were built by giants were, in fact, the Greeks' own ancestors, speaking their own ancestral tongue. The legend and the reality, fused in a single instant of understanding, the myth confirmed as memory. After 3,000 years, the silence of the burned palaces broke, and what came out of it was the deep ancestral murmur of a language still alive in the world today. And here is the bitter, beautiful irony at the center of the whole recovery, the thing that ties it all back to where we began. The reason we can read so many of these last words at all is that the cities burned. The fire that destroyed the world is the same fire that preserved its final tablets. Soft, unfired clay would have crumbled to dust over 3,000 years. It would have left us nothing. But clay that has been baked hard, by a kiln or by a catastrophe, endures almost forever. So the very inferno that ended Ugarit, that ended the fortress palaces, that ended a civilization, is the reason the last letters survived to be read. The catastrophe was its own undoing. In destroying the world, it accidentally fossilized the world's final moments and shipped them, in a bottle of baked clay, 3,000 years downstream, to us. The scribe in the burning workshop did get his message to the future after all. It just took an apocalypse to deliver it.
The recovery did not stop with the words. It went down into the sea. The little trading ship at the bottom of the water, the one carrying the copper and the tin and the glass and the ivory, the photograph of the connected world, was found and excavated over many years of patient, dangerous underwater work, divers descending again and again into the deep to lift, piece by piece, the cargo that had lain there since before the collapse. Every ingot, every bead, every fragment recorded and raised,
until a single sunken afternoon from the height of the Bronze Age was reconstructed in full. From the bottom of the sea, the lost world's commerce was brought back to the surface 3,000 years late. And the recovery went into the earth itself, into the climate. Scientists learned to read the weather of the deep past, to drill into ancient lakebeds and cave floors, and pull out cores that hold, layer by layer, a record of every wet and dry year for thousands of years. They learned to read the rings of ancient trees, each ring a season, fat in good years and thin in bad. And by reading these natural archives, they could reconstruct the climate of the world that collapsed, could confirm in the silent testimony of pollen and stone and wood the long drought that the desperate letters had only hinted at, the evidence of the king begging for grain, and the evidence of the failing rains, two completely independent witnesses separated by 3,000 years, agreeing with each other across the gulf of time. The clay said hunger, the earth said drought. And the two testimonies, locked together, finally let us understand what the people living through it never could. Think about what all of this represents. A civilization erased itself so completely that its own descendants forgot it had existed and attributed its works to giants. By every law of memory and time, it should have been lost forever, irretrievable, beyond all recovery, a darkness with no bottom. And instead, through 2 centuries of obsession and brilliance and luck, and the stubborn human refusal to accept oblivion, we got it back. Not all of it. Most of it is gone forever, the names and the lives and the loves drowned in the silence. But enough. Enough to read the last letters. Enough to know the names of kings. Enough to stand in the burned rooms and feel the weight of what happened there. Enough to tell this story at all. And that, in the end, is the answer to the deepest fear the Dark Age represents. The fear of total forgetting. The fear that a world can be lost so completely that it might as well never have existed. Because it turns out that the forgetting was not final. It turns out that human beings, given enough time and enough determination, can reach back across even 3,000 years of darkness and pull the dead back into the light, can make the silent speak, can give a vanished people their names again. The collapse erased them. And then, millennia later, their distant inheritors unerased them, as much as anyone can be unerased. There is a kind of redemption in that, though it is a quiet one. The girl in the citadel, the scribe in the kiln, the king at the water's edge, the watchers on the coast, they died believing, if they had time to believe anything, that they were vanishing without a trace, that the future would never know they had lived. They were wrong. We know. We may not know their individual names, but we know their world, we know their fear, we know their last desperate days. And we have spent this entire time trying to feel what they felt and honor what they lost. The future they thought would never read their message is reading it right now. The bottle washed ashore. 3,000 years late, but it washed ashore. And so we come, at last, back to where we started, back to the kiln at the edge of the dead city where the fire never finished its work. We understand it now, all of it. The world that died, the way it died, the reason it died, the slow, strange thing that grew from its ashes, the long road by which its memory found its way back to us. There is nothing left to explain. There is only one thing left to do, and it is the thing this channel was made for. It is time to close the book. But a book like this one does not close all at once. You do not simply shut it and walk away. The pages resist. They keep turning back, almost on their own, to the places where a face looked up at you from the dark. And before the cover comes down for the last time, those faces deserve to be looked at one more time. Not as evidence, not as data points in the long argument about why a world ended, just as people. Because that is what they were, underneath everything. And it is the one thing the centuries try hardest to take from them. So go back to the very beginning, to the kiln at the edge of the dying city, and to the man whose hands left their prints in clay that was never meant to last this long. We never learned his name. We never will. He was a scribe, or a scribe's apprentice, or perhaps only a frightened man who knew how to press wedges into wet earth, and was given a stack of tablets and told to bake them before the fire reached the walls. Picture him for one more moment. The smoke is thick. The shouting outside has changed in character. It is no longer the sound of a city defending itself, but the sound of a city being taken apart. He works anyway. He stacks the tablets in the kiln because that is the task he was given, and the task is the last solid thing left in a world that is dissolving around him. He does not know that he is performing an act of preservation. He thinks he is following orders. He thinks, if he thinks anything at all beyond his own terror, that he is buying his masters a little more time, a little more order, a little more of the ordinary world that is vanishing by the minute.
He did not finish.
We know he did not finish, because the fire that should have hardened those tablets slowly was instead the fire that ate the city, and it baked them all at once, violently, perfectly, in a heat no kiln was meant to reach. He almost certainly died. Somewhere in that collapse, in that day he could not have imagined when he first learned his trade, he stopped being a living man and became one of the uncounted dead of a catastrophe that left no room for counting. And yet, 3,000 years later, his hands are the first thing the archaeologist sees. The shape of his work, the pressure of his fingers, the last words he was given to record, frozen mid-thought. He has no tomb. He has no monument. He has something stranger and, in a way, more intimate. He has reached across the entire span of recorded history and put a clay tablet directly into your hands and said, without saying anything, I was here. I was working. The world was ending and I did not stop. There is no name on it. There does not need to be. You felt him. That was the point. That is the only resurrection any of us is promised, and he received it from the very catastrophe that killed him. Now go back to the citadel and to the girl on the wall. We invented her, or rather, we assembled her out of 1,000 real girls who must have stood exactly where we placed her, on the high stone of a Mycenaean fortress, looking out at a sea that had always been the source of everything good. The bronze, the stories, the painted pottery and the foreign words, and the sense that her small world was joined to a vast and shining web of other worlds, all of them sending their gifts toward her, all of them reachable. She grew up believing that the walls behind her had been built by giants, because no human hand could stack stones so large, and if giants built your home, then surely nothing could ever truly threaten it. We left her looking at the horizon, waiting for ships that always came. And the cruelty of where we left her is that you already know what she does not. You know that the ships stopped coming. You know that the web she trusted was not strength but exposure, that every thread connecting her to the wider world was also a thread along which catastrophe could travel. You know that the giants did not exist, that the walls were built by people exactly as mortal as she was, and that walls, even the walls of giants, do not save a civilization when the thing destroying it arrives not as an army at the gate, but as a slow unraveling of everything that made the gate matter. She did not see it coming. That was never a failure of intelligence or courage. It was the simple, devastating fact that no one inside a golden age can perceive its edges. The light is too bright to see past. She lived her whole life inside the assumption that tomorrow would resemble today, because every single tomorrow she had ever experienced had done exactly that. The assumption was correct 10,000 times in a row. It was wrong once. And being wrong once, at the wrong moment, was enough to turn her painted, plastered, giant-walled world into a layer of ash and a question mark in the soil. When the Greeks came back centuries later and found her fortress, they could not believe people had built it. So they invented the giants she had already believed in. Her myth survived her. Her name did not. She became, without ever knowing it, one of the silent foundations beneath the stories that an entire civilization would later tell about its own lost grandeur. Every hero who ever stood on those walls in a poem was standing on the memory of someone like her, someone real, someone who watched the horizon and trusted it right up until the end. Go back, now, to the watchers on the coast. They are the ones I think about most, if I am honest, of all the people in this story. Not the kings, not the scribes, the watchers. The men whose entire purpose, recorded in plain administrative language on the tablets at Pylos, was to stand at the edge of the land and look at the water, to guard the coast, to raise the alarm. We have their dispositions, their stations, the dry bureaucratic note that they were watching. And then we have the burned palace, and the silence, and the absolute absence of any record of what they saw. Imagine being one of them. Imagine the long, ordinary boredom of the job. Most days, the sea is just the sea. You watch the light change on the water. You watch the fishing boats. You watch nothing happen, day after day after day, and the watching becomes a habit so deep you almost stop seeing the horizon as anything but background. That is the trap of the lookout. You are positioned precisely to see the end coming, and the very nature of your job, the endless repetition of nothing, slowly trains you to expect that nothing is exactly what you will continue to see. And then, one day, the horizon is wrong. There is something on it that does not belong. More than one something. The shapes resolve, the way shapes do, slower than you want them to, and then all at once. And the boredom of years evaporates in a single heartbeat, and you understand, too late, far too late, in the only moment that was ever going to matter, that the thing you were placed here to watch for has finally arrived, and there is nothing you can do about it but exactly what you were told to do. Raise the alarm. Run. Send the word inland. We have the orders that prove the system existed. We do not have a single line proving the system worked. The palace burned anyway. The watchers watched, and the watching did not save them. And that gap, between seeing and stopping, between knowing and surviving, is the most human gap there is. It is the gap we all live inside. We see the things that frighten us. Seeing is not the same as preventing. The watchers knew that in their last hour. We spend our whole lives trying not to know it. Go back to the harbor at Ugarit, and to the king who wrote the letter. Amurapi. We have his name, which is more than most of them got. We have his words, which is far more than that. We have the actual sentences a doomed king set down as his kingdom came apart. The enemy ships have come. They have burned my towns. My army is in another country. My fleet is away. And the question underneath every line of it, the question he was too disciplined or too desperate to write but that bleeds through anyway. Where is everyone? Where is the help? Where is the great web of allies and brother kings and shared interests that was supposed to make a moment like this impossible? It did not come. It could not come. Because the web was burning everywhere at once, and the same fire that was consuming his city was consuming the cities he was writing to. He sent his letter into a world that was no longer there to receive it. He was, without knowing it, the last king of a place that had been a crossroads of the entire Eastern Mediterranean for centuries, a place where the languages and goods and gods of a dozen peoples met and mingled and made something richer than any of them could have made alone. And that richness, that openness, that magnificent connectedness was exactly what could not be defended. The crossroads is the first place the storm reaches. The harbor that lets the whole world in cannot close fast enough to keep the end out. His tablet survived because the city burned. We keep arriving at that unbearable irony, and we keep having to sit with it, because it is the central irony of this entire story. The fire that ended him is the reason we can hear him. If Ugarit had survived, if the danger had passed and the clerks had swept up, and the tablet had been filed away and reused, and eventually crumbled into ordinary dust like the overwhelming majority of all human writing ever produced, we would never have known he existed. His panic is legible to us only because his panic was justified. He is speaking to you across 3,000 years for one reason. He was right to be afraid. Go back to Egypt, to the village of the tomb builders, to the men who put down their tools. They did not know they were making history. That is worth saying plainly because it is true of almost everyone in this story and almost everyone in any story. The workers at Deir el-Medina, the skilled craftsmen who carved and painted the resting places of pharaohs, simply wanted to be paid. The grain that was owed to them had not arrived. It was late, and then it was later, and the hunger in their houses was not a philosophical abstraction, but a real thing happening to real children. And so they did something no record had ever described before. They stopped. They walked off the job. They sat down in the mortuary temples of god kings and refused to move until they were fed. We call it the first recorded strike in human history, and it is, and that matters. But notice what it really was. It was the sound of a system failing from the inside, recorded by the system itself in its own meticulous handwriting. Egypt survived the Great Collapse, survived the Sea Peoples, survived the Battle of the Delta, survived as the last great power left standing when so many others had fallen. And here, in the careful records of a village of artisans, you can watch that survival quietly curdle. The state was still there. The state could no longer reliably feed the people who served it. The grain that didn't come was a small thing, an administrative hiccup, and it was also the visible edge of an enormous invisible thing, the slow draining away of the surplus, the security, the dependable abundance that had made Egypt, Egypt for 2,000 years. The strikers won, more or less. They got their grain, eventually, that time. But the world that could feed them without thinking about it was gone, and it was not coming back. And somewhere in the back of their minds, the most perceptive of them must have felt it. The way you feel a change in the weather before the sky shows it. The certainty was leaking out of the world. They had built tombs for kings who believed they were eternal. They lived to see the eternity start to crack. And then, much later, in the same valley, came the robbers. The tomb robberies that swept through Egypt in the centuries after the collapse were not random crimes. They were a confession. For 2,000 years, the tombs of the dead had been sacred and inviolable, protected not only by guards and curses, but by something far stronger, by a shared, unquestioned belief that the dead belonged to eternity and their treasures belonged to the gods. Robbing a tomb was not merely illegal, it was unthinkable. And the moment it became thinkable, the moment ordinary, frightened, hungry people began breaking into the houses of the dead and stripping the gold from the bodies of god kings, something far more important than gold had already been stolen. The belief was gone. The certainty that the old order was permanent, that the gods were watching, that the line between sacred and profane was real and would hold, that had collapsed first, silently, inside people's hearts, and the robberies were simply the proof of a faith that had already died. Go back, finally, to the bottom of the sea. Off the southern coast of Anatolia, beneath the bright water, a ship has been lying on its side for more than 3,000 years. It went down with everything it carried, the copper ingot stacked like enormous chocolate bars, the tin that would have married that copper into bronze, the raw blue glass, the elephant tusks and hippopotamus teeth, the jars of resin, the beads, the tools, the small personal things of the men who sailed her. We will never know exactly why she sank. A storm, most likely, a rock in the dark, the ordinary, stupid, eternal hazards of putting wood and rope between yourself and the sea. Here is what catches in the throat about that ship. She is not a record of the collapse. She is a record of the world before it. The world at its absolute height. The world working exactly as it was supposed to. Her cargo is the entire interconnected age compressed into a single hull. Copper from one place, tin from impossibly far away, luxuries from a half-dozen kingdoms. All of it moving together, all of it bound for some palace that needed it, all of it proof of a planet stitched together by trade and trust, and the long sea roads that carried both. She sank doing the thing that defined her age, and then her age sank too, not under the water, but under the weight of its own connections. And so she became something she was never meant to be, a perfect, sealed, accidental museum of a world that no longer existed even before anyone went looking for her. The divers who found her did not find treasure, not really. not in the way the word usually means. They found understanding. Each ingot lifted from the seabed, each tusk, each bead, was a sentence in a language we had been trying to read for a century. The language of how this world actually functioned. Who traded with whom? How far the threads reached? How fragile the whole shimmering arrangement truly was. The men who sailed her drowned anonymous and afraid in the dark water, as far from glory as a person can get, and they handed us, without ever meaning to, the clearest picture we will ever have of the age they lived and died in. The sea took them. The sea also kept them. The sea is the only honest archive. It does not edit, it does not boast. It simply holds whatever falls into it until someone is finally ready to look. And go back, one last time, to the quiet room where a man stared at a script no one could read. For decades, the clay tablets of the Mycenaeans sat in museums and storerooms, covered in a writing that defeated everyone who tried it. Linear B, they called it, because there had been an even older script before it. It was a wall. The people who made those marks were utterly silent, locked behind symbols that yielded nothing. And the assumption, the comfortable, almost universal assumption, was that the language hiding inside them would turn out to be something exotic and lost. Some vanished tongue with no living descendants. A dead voice in a dead alphabet. The man who finally broke it was not even a professional scholar of the ancient world. He was an architect, a man who read floor plans for a living, who had been fascinated by the puzzle since he was a boy, and who approached it the way you approach a building, looking for the load-bearing structure, the hidden grid, the logic underneath the surface. He built grids of symbols. He tracked which signs appeared with which. He treated it not as a language to be guessed, but as a system to be solved. And slowly, impossibly, the grid began to speak. When the answer came, it was not the exotic, lost tongue everyone expected. It was Greek. Early Greek. Clumsy, archaic, centuries older than anyone had thought Greek could be written, but unmistakably, undeniably Greek. The people behind the Cyclopean walls, the people the later Greeks had turned into half-divine heroes of a vanished golden age, the people the girl on the wall belonged to, they had been Greeks all along. The myth and the history were the same people. Homer's heroes had clerks. The Trojan War, whatever truth lay beneath it, had been fought by people who kept inventory lists. The decipherment did not just crack a code. It collapsed the distance between legend and reality, and it gave the dead their own voice back. Not our description of them, not our reconstruction, but their own words, in their own language, written by their own hands before the fire took everything. He died young, that architect, not long after the greatest intellectual achievement of his life, in an ordinary accident on an ordinary road, the kind of meaningless ending that the universe hands out without regard for what a person has done. He never got to grow old inside his own discovery. But the dead he had freed went on speaking, and they are speaking still. And every time someone reads one of those tablets and understands it, his work and their voices come alive together. He gave them back their language. The collapse had taken it from them and buried it in fire and silence for 3,000 years. And one stubborn man who read buildings for a living reached down into that silence and pulled their words back into the light. So here we are. The faces have been looked at. The threads have been followed back to their sources. And the book is still open in your hands, because there is one question left that all of this has been circling. The way water circles a drain. Slowly at first, and then faster, and then all at once. The question is not why the Bronze Age ended. We have spent hours on that. Drought and earthquake and famine and migration and the brittle, beautiful interdependence of a world that had grown too connected to survive a shock and too specialized to feed itself when the connections broke. We understand the how of it as well as we are ever likely to. No, the question that remains is quieter and far more uncomfortable, and it is the question that has been sitting in the back of the room this entire time, waiting for the noise to die down so it could finally be heard. Why does it matter to you? Why should the death of a world you never knew, a world of kings whose names are mostly lost, and gods who turned out to be powerless, and cities whose ruins you will never visit. Why should any of it reach into your chest the way it does? You did not live there. You owe those people nothing. Their catastrophe is so old that the very language they screamed in has to be reassembled grid by architects in quiet rooms. By every reasonable measure, the end of the Bronze Age should be as emotionally distant from you as the weather on a planet that has not yet been discovered. And yet here you are, still listening, still feeling it. Why? I think the answer is the most important thing this story has to give, and it is not a lesson about supply chains or climate or the fragility of civilization, useful as those reflections are. It is something simpler and far stranger. It is recognition. When you feel the scribe's terror in the kiln, you are not learning history. You are recognizing yourself, because you too have followed the task in front of you, while the larger thing fell apart around you. You have kept working, kept the small order going, because the small order was the only thing you could still control. When you feel the girl on the wall trusting a horizon that is about to betray her, you recognize yourself, because you too live inside assumptions you cannot see. You too believe in giants that built your world. You too are certain that tomorrow will look like today. And you are right about that 10,000 times in a row, and you do not get to know which time will be the exception. When you feel the watchers seeing the wrong shape on the water, you recognize the gap you live inside every day. The gap between knowing and preventing, between seeing the thing coming and being able to stop it. These people are not foreign to you. They are you, in different clothes, under a different sky, speaking different words, doing the exact same things human beings have always done in the face of a world that is larger than they are, and that does not, finally, care whether they survive. Their fear is your fear. Their hope is your hope. Their refusal to stop working, to stop loving, to stop building tombs and writing letters, and watching the sea even when watching could not save them. That is the most human thing there is, and it has not changed in 3,000 years, and it will not change in 3,000 more. The clothes change, the cities change, the gods change. The thing inside the clothes, inside the cities, looking up at the gods, that has not changed at all. That is why it reaches into your chest. You are not mourning strangers. You are mourning yourself and your children and everyone you love, and the strange, doomed, magnificent thing it is to be a conscious creature who knows that everything ends and builds anyway. And that is where the comfort hides, if there is comfort to be found here. And I think there is. Because the other half of the story, the half we tend to forget while we are busy being frightened by the collapse, is that it was not the end. The world ended. People did not. The thread did not break. It bent, it nearly snapped, it disappeared underground for centuries into a darkness so complete that the people living in it forgot how to write. But it held. Somewhere in the worst of it, a mother still taught her child to speak. A potter still shaped a pot, plainer than his grandfather's, but a pot. Someone still remembered a song from before and sang it, and someone younger learned it, and the song traveled down through the dark on nothing but breath and memory until generations later, a blind poet gathered all those remembered songs into a story about heroes and giants and a war over a beautiful city. And that story became the foundation of an entire civilization that did not yet exist when the songs began. The iron came. The cheap, common, democratic iron, lying in the ground almost everywhere, freeing the world from its terrible dependence on a single, far-off mine. The alphabet came, a handful of simple signs that anyone could learn, that took the power of writing out of the hands of a tiny scribal elite and began, slowly, to hand it to everyone. New peoples came and settled and farmed and intermarried and became, in time, simply the people who lived there. The web that had been too fragile to survive was replaced over centuries by something tougher and lower and more spread out, something that did not depend on every thread holding it once. The collapse did not just destroy, it cleared, it made room. The very catastrophe that ended one world was the soil in which the next one grew. And that next world, harder, plainer, more durable, more widely literate, more our own, is the direct ancestor of everything you know. You are reading these words in an alphabet that exists because the palaces fell. Think about that for as long as you can stand to. The democratization of writing, the spread of literacy across every layer of society, instead of being locked in the hands of a few palace clerks. The entire long road that leads eventually to a world where an ordinary person can read and write and record their own existence. That road began in the rubble. The thing that took the scribe's specialized power away from him gave it, eventually, to everyone. He died so that his particular kind of knowledge could become extinct. And out of that extinction grew a world where the knowledge belongs to all of us. He would not have understood it. He would not have wanted it. And he is part of the reason it happened anyway. There is one more thing to sit with before the cover comes down, and it is the hardest thing of all, so we will not rush it. Every single person in this story believed their world was permanent, not consciously, not as a thing they argued about. They believed it the way you believe the floor will be there when you put your foot down in the dark. The kings of the Great Age sent each other letters that began with elaborate greetings, assuming 100 more years of friendship between dynasties that had centuries behind them. The girl on the wall could not have conceived of a world without the ships, because there had never been one. The scribe filed his tablets in a system that had worked for so long that working was simply what it did. They were all, every one of them, standing inside a structure so old and so solid that questioning whether it would last would have seemed not frightening but absurd, like questioning whether the sun would rise. And it was all gone within the span of a single lifetime. A child born into the height of that world could have lived to see it utterly destroyed, could have grown up in painted palaces with foreign luxuries and bronze tools and the comfortable certainty of an eternal order, and grown old in a hut, illiterate, in the ruins, telling grandchildren stories about a vanished age of giants that the grandchildren only half believed. One lifetime, that is all it took to fall from the summit of an age to the bottom of a dark that would last for centuries. I am not telling you this to frighten you, though I understand if it does. I am telling you because it is the truest thing the past has to say to the present, and it says it not as a threat, but as a kind of terrible companionship. Every age believes it is the permanent one. Every age is wrong. This is not a prophecy about your world. I have no prophecy. No one does. And anyone who claims to read your future in the ashes of the Bronze Age is selling you something. It is something gentler and more unsettling than a prophecy. It is simply the company of everyone who came before you, all of them whispering the same quiet truth across the centuries. We thought it would last forever too. We were sure of it. We were exactly as sure as you are. And we were people, just like you. And we were not stupid, and we did not see it. And that is not a flaw in us. It is the condition of being alive inside a world. You cannot see the edges of your own age. None of us ever could. What survives, in the end, is not the power. The kings are gone. The empires are gone. The gold was robbed from the tombs and melted down and lost. The walls fell. The harbors silted up. The names of almost everyone who ever lived in that world dissolved completely and forever. The mightiest people of the age left less behind than the frightened scribe whose only monument is a clay tablet baked by the fire that killed him. What survives is the human moment, the hand in the clay, the letter sent into the dark, the watcher's terror, the king's disbelief, the strikers sitting down in the temple of a god-king and refusing to starve in silence. The song carried on breath through 3 centuries of darkness. The words, the small human words, pressed into earth and preserved by accident and catastrophe, and the patient love of strangers who would not be born for 3,000 years. That is what lasts. Not the strength, the tenderness, Not the empire, the person, alone, doing a human thing in the face of an inhuman ending, leaving behind not a boast, but a trace. I was here. I was afraid. I kept working. I loved someone. The world was ending, and I did not stop being a person. And the strangest, most beautiful thing of all is the bargain hidden inside that. Those people are not entirely gone. As long as the tablet is read, the scribe's last hour is happening. As long as the letter is translated, the king is still calling for help, and we are still, finally, answering. Too late to save him, but answering all the same. Hearing him, refusing to let his last words fall into nothing. The act of remembering is not passive. It is a kind of resurrection. Every time you feel the fear of a person who died 3,000 years ago, you are reaching back through that impossible distance and saying, "You mattered. You were real. Your terror was not meaningless. I am holding it now. You are not alone in it anymore." That is what this is for. That is what the reading is for. The dead cannot speak, but they can be heard, and being heard is the only afterlife any of them ever truly got, and it turns out to be enough. It turns out to be everything. And maybe that is the quiet bargain this whole story has been trying to offer you, underneath the fear and the fire and the falling cities. Not a warning, not a prophecy, a promise. The promise that nothing real is ever fully lost, as long as someone, somewhere, someday, is willing to kneel in the ash and look. The scribe did not know your name. You do not know his. And across an ocean of years that should have made the two of you complete strangers, a current still runs between his frightened hands and yours. The oldest current there is, older than bronze, older than writing. The simple, unbroken fact of one human being recognizing another. Every empire in this story trusted in its strength, and its strength betrayed it. The only thing that did not betray anyone, in the end, was that current. The willingness to remember. The refusal to let the dead be nothing. When your own world ends, and it will, every world does, slowly or all at once, in fire or in silence, or simply in the long forgetting that takes everything eventually. What you will leave behind is not your power either. It will be the human moment, the trace, the small true thing you pressed into the earth without knowing anyone would ever read it. And if you are lucky, almost unbearably lucky, someone far in the future will lift it out of the ground and feel the warmth of it and understand. That is the inheritance the Bronze Age left us. Not bronze. The reaching. The reaching is the thing that lasts. So now, at last, we can close it. Not the way you slam a book you are glad to be done with. The other way. The way you close a book you have loved, slowly, with your hand resting on the cover for a moment afterward, because some part of you is not ready to leave the people inside. Go back, one final time, to where we began. The kiln at the edge of the dead city. The fire that never finished its work and finished it too well. The tablet stacked in the dark, waiting for a slow baking that never came, receiving instead a violent one that froze a single moment forever. The moment the world ended, captured in clay, signed by no one, addressed to everyone, sealed and sent down the long river of time toward a shore none of them could imagine. The smoke has cleared now. It cleared 3,000 years ago. The shouting stopped. The fires burned down to nothing. The city that was a crossroads of the world became a low mound of earth with grass growing over it, and for 30 centuries no one came, and the sea went on rolling against a coast that had forgotten the ships, and the great web of kingdoms and trade and brother kings and giant walled fortresses became first a rumor, then a legend, then a half-remembered story about heroes, and then nothing at all. The watchers stopped watching. The horizon stayed empty. The age that had believed itself eternal kept its faith right up until the moment it stopped existing, and then it was simply over, the way everything is over eventually, the way your age will one day be over, quietly, in soil, under grass, beneath a sea that does not remember. And then someone came back, with a small brush and infinite patience, with grids of symbols and diving tanks and the slow, stubborn, almost holy refusal to let the silence be the last word. They knelt in the dirt of the dead city, and they lifted a tablet out of the ash, and it was warm in their hands the way nothing that old has any right to be. And they turned it over, and there were the fingerprints of a frightened man, and there were his last unfinished words. And the scribe who died 3,000 years ago looked up out of the clay, and was, against every law of time and death and forgetting, seen. That is the whole story in the end. A world that thought it would last forever, and didn't. A catastrophe with no single name and no single cause, that no one saw coming because no one ever can. A darkness that swallowed the light so completely that the people inside it forgot how to write their own names. And then, slowly, out of the ruins, a new world, harder, plainer, tougher, ours, growing in the soil of the old one's grave. And running through all of it, surviving all of it, the only thing that ever really survives? The human voice, pressed into earth, calling out across the centuries, refusing to be nothing, finally and at last being heard. The bottle washed ashore, the letter was delivered, the dead got their voices back. We answered, as best we could, as late as we were. And now the book can close, because the people inside it are no longer alone. And that was the only thing that ever needed to be done. The fire is out. The clay is cold. The city sleeps under its hill, and the sea has nothing more to say. And somewhere a scribe who has no name has finally finished his work. Not the work he meant to do, but the work that mattered, the only work that lasts. He reached us. They all reached us. And we will carry them a little further down the river before we, too, hand them to whoever comes after. The book is closed now. Rest your hand on the cover for a moment, the way you do with a story you do not want to leave. Feel the weight of 3,000 years inside it, and the strange warmth of having held it. Then set it gently back on the shelf, beside all the others, the empires and the kingdoms, the golden ages and the silences, the worlds that believed they would never end, and the people who lived inside them, and loved and feared and worked, right up until the fire came. They were here. They were real. They mattered. And now, at last, they have been remembered. And this was one of history's last chapters.